Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Vanessa walked through the streets of the city, keeping behind the backs of passers-by. For the first time in her life, she was a grown family woman following a man. And that man was her husband, Andrew. Was Jenna right? A coworker from work who lived near the place said she'd seen Andrew in a restaurant with a girl a couple times. Handsome, blonde, long-legged, stylish couple discussing something animatedly. Sometimes the lady cheerfully stroking Andrew on the shoulder. The dates were wrong, Vanessa asserted confidently. Between her and Andrew, there had always been a trusting, close relationship. They shared each other's joys and worries, told each other how the day had gone. No, of course, Jenna was wrong. She'd only seen the man a couple times in her life, so she confused him with someone else. Jenna was skeptical of marriage in general. The woman had met Andrew practically right in front of her eyes. And Jenna then confidently declared that the relationship had no prospects. Oh, friend, I'd be careful not to get enchanted before you're disappointed. Been there, done that. It hurts afterwards. Vanessa realized that there was some truth in what her colleague said. But next to Andrew, she felt so loved, so protected. He looked at her with loving tenderness, protected her, tried to please her. It could not be a deception. It wasn't a deception either. Declared in response to Vanessa's objections, the much-experienced Jenna. Now he really feels that you are the woman of his life. Love period, all that sort of thing. But time will pass. He will look at the situation with sober eyes and realize everything. Vanessa realized that maybe her friend was right. Andrew was so perfect, so handsome. The turquoise eyes on his tanned face alone are worth it. And those dimples on his cheeks that appear when Andrew smiles. Vanessa was ready to admire his smile endlessly. She had never felt that way about anyone before. Andrew, a lead engineer at a major oil company. He has nearly 100 people under him of intelligent, determined acumen. The man had a prestigious university under his belt. He was persuaded to stay in the capital. He didn't want to leave his hometown. His parents are already quite elderly here. Andrew is their only and very late child. The man could not leave his father's mother alone. So he came back, which, in his own words, he has never regretted. Andrew's parents are wealthy people. His father was once a big businessman by the standards of their city. He had his own dairy, which was once very profitable. Before that, the man was in the restaurant business in New York. But after the birth of his child, he decided to change his line of work. The family moved from the capital to a quiet provincial town with a developed infrastructure, but much more pleasant ecology. Always thought that children are more pleasant and easier to raise in small towns. This is how Anna, Andrew's mother, talked about the move many years ago. Vanessa had a perfect relationship with the Candles in spite of silly stereotypes. In a way, they replaced her parents, although they were more like grandparents in age. Her own. Vanessa remembered her mother and father vaguely. They had died when the girl was only 5 years old. They went to the forest for mushrooms, got confused. They were searched, then searched for a long time. But the Taita is dangerous and unpredictable. Vanessa's mom and dad joined the list of people missing in the forests. There were a lot of such cases then, and even now such cases are not rare. Anyway, little Vanessa was taken in by her grandmother, her paternal grandmother. She raised her granddaughter, tried to give her everything she needed. Vanessa adored her grandmother. But when the girl was only 20 years old, her only relative was gone. Heart age, Vanessa was left all alone. And so wanted the love of support of a close person next to her. That's probably why she contacted Mark. At first, he seemed like perfection. When the tragedy happened, the girl was in her 3rd year at the University of Economics. She got there thanks to her grandmother. From childhood, she had taught her granddaughter that she should learn to strive for a better life. Their small family, according to Vanessa, was not poor. At least, they certainly did not starve. But the grandmother kept lamenting that she could not take her granddaughter, show, and big cities other countries. The girl did not understand these worries, not quite satisfied with her life. I then in my time traveled around the world thanks to work. The old woman persuaded me. She worked as a train conductor all her life and visited many interesting places. Grandma loved to reminisce about those happy times, and her granddaughter just loved her stories. Well, what are your years it will still be? Vanessa was perplexed. But what is so interesting about traveling? Well, yes, grandmother tells quite fascinating. But why be upset that there is no money for traveling now? You can watch all that stuff on TV. Then, when Andrew showed Vanessa the world, she realized what Grandma meant. It was only a pity to share it with a relative, impressions Vanessa could no longer share. Andrew, this is the best gift that fate has given Vanessa. He literally changed the life and outlook of a woman. Next to her spouse, she always felt at peace. They have already been together for so many years, and nothing has changed. All the same tenderness, admiration. Both have become each other's kin. They haven't been hurt by the household as many mourned. Andrew still looks at his wife with love. He still tries to surprise and please her. The prophecies of acquaintances about the futility of this relationship, including Jenna's predictions, did not come true, or they did. Maybe it is now that Vanessa will recognize her husband. On the other hand, why was he out on the street at this time? Andrew's supposed to be home taking care of their sick son. What's he doing here? Probably in a hurry to meet that hot blonde Jenna told me about. He's about to find out. The woman's heart pounded, starting to give her a headache. She was used to trusting her husband with everything. And from childhood, she had taught her granddaughter that she should learn to strive for a better life. Their small family, according to Vanessa, was not poor. At least, they certainly did not starve. But the grandmother kept lamenting that she could not take her granddaughter, show, and big cities other countries. The girl did not understand these worries, not quite satisfied with her life. I then in my time traveled around the world thanks to work. The old woman persuaded me. She worked as a train conductor all her life and visited many interesting places. Grandma loved to reminisce about those happy times, and her granddaughter just loved her stories. Well, what are your years it will still be? Vanessa was perplexed. But what is so interesting about traveling? Well, yes, grandmother tells quite fascinating. But why be upset that there is no money for traveling now? You can watch all that stuff on TV. Then, when Andrew showed Vanessa the world, she realized what Grandma meant. It was only a pity to share it with a relative, impressions Vanessa could no longer share. Andrew, this is the best gift that fate has given Vanessa. He literally changed the life and outlook of a woman. Next to her spouse, she always felt at peace. They have already been together for so many years, and nothing has changed. All the same tenderness, admiration. Both have become each other's kin. They haven't been hurt by the household as many mourned. Andrew still looks at his wife with love. He still tries to surprise and please her. The prophecies of acquaintances about the futility of this relationship, including Jenna's predictions, did not come true, or they did. Maybe it is now that Vanessa will recognize her husband. On the other hand, why was he out on the street at this time? Andrew's supposed to be home taking care of their sick son. What's he doing here? Probably in a hurry to meet that hot blonde Jenna told me about. That's odd. Her husband favored name brands, not out of snobbery. No, that wasn't in the man's character at all. Despite his high salary and brilliant career, he was simply more comfortable in branded quality shoes. Where did he get those sneakers from the market? And Andrew looked subtly different. Different look, light stubble, but usually shaved face and tiredness. But of course, it was Andrew. Vanessa would recognize her husband in any image, the light spring, the gestures, the gait, the beautiful, swarthy skin tone, the bright turquoise eyes that once surrounded a woman's head. She still often admired them. Andrew kept walking forward. Vanessa followed him. Why did he go on foot? Her husband usually traveled by car. He wasn't particularly fond of walking. Vanessa was already long late for work since lunch, came out of the office to have a snack, suddenly noticed her husband, and of course, hurried after him. No big deal. She warned Svetlana that she would think of something to say to her superiors. It wasn't the first time the friends had helped each other out. So Jenna, she's got nothing to worry about. Finally, Andrew pulled into one of the restaurants, which were plentiful on both sides of the main street. Vanessa froze. Jenna's words that she had seen her husband in a cafe with a beautiful blonde were going over and over in her head. A coworker friend had told her about it just the other day. Vanessa was then sure that Jenna was mistaken. After all, Jenna at one time she did not believe to the last that Vanessa with Andrew everything will work out. About what the friend repeatedly stated out loud. Jenna's own experience showed that it was simply impossible. Andrew is handsome, promising, wealthy, young, and free. And she's Vanessa too, of course, beautiful. You can't argue with that. But she's still a different bird. She lives in a cramped, one-room apartment inherited from her grandmother. She works in a small firm as an economist for pennies. And most importantly, she's raising her daughter alone. Who needs someone else's child? Is such a prince a match for a lady with a trailer? Question Jenna. She'll go out for a walk. And I wouldn't count on a serious thing if I were you. The words of my colleague sounded quite logical and convincing. Indeed, why would Andrew want someone else's child? And his parents would probably object. At that time, Vanessa was not yet acquainted with her mother-in-law and could not even imagine how happy they would be with Emily and her daughter. Emily, yet meeting Mark had a positive side to it. He had given her the priceless gift of a beautiful, healthy daughter and just vanished from her life. His commitments gravitated toward family life. The guy wasn't ready. Well, you can't blame him for that. Leaving the baby was entirely Vanessa's decision, and it wasn't an easy decision. The woman still shuddered at the desperate situation she found herself in almost 13 years ago. Vanessa was only a few steps away from the biggest mistake of her life. It was logical and easier for her to have an abortion at that time. What a blessing that a very young Vanessa didn't. Rainier had already turned 12. Tall, slender, big eyes. Outwardly, she resembles Mark, but no one is in the least bit upset about it. Mark, what can be said? He is a real beauty, dark almond, colored eyes, black, shiny hair. There was a touch of Oriental blood in him. Black cheekbones, well-defined lips. All of this was passed on to Emily. She was already a teenage girl. When Vanessa went out with her daughter, she often caught glances from boys and even older guys in the arena. Just a little longer, and her daughter would blossom into a beautiful young woman. The thought that she might not have been at all. Vanessa sometimes had goosebumps running down her spine. When her grandmother died, Vanessa was left all alone. On her passport, she had long since been an adult of 20 years as Vanessa, but in fact, the girl felt almost like a child. Her grandmother always took care of her, cooked delicious meals for her granddaughter, calmed her down, even woke them up in the morning for university. She wrapped Vanessa with care and love as a warm, cozy blanket. And now the girl was unbearably cold and homesick, and scared. Vanessa missed her grandmother desperately. She cried a lot during that difficult period. In public, of course, she kept to herself, but at home, she let her feelings out, sobbing, reading her grief. The realization that she was all alone frightened her and even drove her into a panic. How to live in the world if you are not needed and not interesting to anybody? If you do not need a reliable shoulder of your favorite person? And just at that moment she met Mark, dark-haired, good-looking guy who worked part-time as a janitor. Always cheerful and smiling and energetic and agile. Always positive. Vanessa noticed, of course, that the young janitor looked back at her when she was coming home from the steam. But guys like that, they probably don't miss a skirt at all. After a while, Mark began to greet Vanessa and smile broadly. It was to her that the girl could not stay sad and sorrowful. At times like this, Mark's smile was too infectious. No one could resist. As if imperceptibly in the girl arose sympathy for this guy. Their relationship had grown to the point where they sometimes talked about things around the house. Now Vanessa knew that Mark had come here from the village. His family was there. He served in the army, went to college, but money is scarce. His parents are not wealthy, to say the least, so he works part-time. Mark knew a lot of things about Vanessa too. For example, the fact that she lived all alone and that the girl studied in a prestigious university of economics. One day, Mark asked Vanessa out on a date. The girl was taken aback by such an offer. Mark was clearly very embarrassed, blushing, stammering, looking down at his feet. It was not at all like the conversation of a cheerful young man. And that's why it looked especially sweet and touching. Of course she didn't. Mark didn't have the money. So the young people went to the embankment, walked, talked, held hands, then kissed. Vanessa felt herself drawn more and more to Mark. He was so nice, so interesting. He had just turned 22. But in his years, he had seen and learned so much that some of them had never even dreamed of. Her life was relatively quiet and prosperous, whereas Mark had to work from the age of 11 to help the family and the army to pass, and in trouble. Serious get in and get out of them. Constant adventures. Mark walked Vanessa home to the driveway. The girl suddenly realized that she didn't want to part with him at all, but she didn't dare to invite him to her place. Then she didn't. Later, Mark did move in with her, and Vanessa was happy with him for a long time, almost 2 years. Mark masterfully fried potatoes and scrambled eggs and cleaned the apartment in a flash. All this guy did much better than Vanessa, who was raised like a princess by her grandmother, because she cherished and pitied him. And he also knew how to fix faucets and repair furniture. Life had taught him all that. Most of Vanessa's time was taken up with studying. Mark, on the other hand, was not particularly in need of science. He was listed in the construction technician's office, but he hardly ever showed up. He preferred to make money there. However, it was not so good either. Mark's casual earnings and a part-time janitor's salary and Vanessa's social scholarship. That's all there was to the budget. Had to save money on everything. It was a little frustrating for the guy, as he wanted a beautiful life. But Vanessa was happy as it was. The main thing is that Mark is a loving person, so sensitive, so understanding. He always knew when Vanessa needed support and gave it to her. The guy was never stingy with words and generously bestowed the girl with compliments, from which she melted. But Mark often went out with friends without Vanessa, and she didn't mind because she had no time to go out anyway, because she had a lot of projects to do at school. Sometimes, though, when I looked at Vanessa going to her friends, I was jealous. I wondered if there were any girls there, and Mark is so handsome, so sociable. Who can resist him? But the guy assured that he didn't notice anyone but Vanessa, and he didn't need anyone at all. He's happy as he is. It's just friends. Guys will sit and talk. It's like a relaxation for us guys, you know? Vanessa nodded, but still stayed home, not with a calm heart. Her intuition told her that not everything was as smooth as Mark said. But the girl consciously drowned out that weak inner voice. 2 years flew by like a day. Vanessa was already in her final year of college. Mark was also finishing his technical degree. Soon they would both be professionals, able to get jobs. And then at last, there would be no need to save money on the essentials. Maybe even a trip to the sea. That would be wonderful. One February morning, Vanessa realized she was expecting a baby. Of course, she and Mark hadn't planned any children yet. They were still on their own 2 feet, barely getting by. But an unplanned pregnancy is not an exceptional case. It happens quite often. Vanessa's not the first, and she won't be the last. People manage somehow, and yet the girl was scared. She even had sweat on her back when she looked at the test with 2 strips, which she made to know for sure. How Mark would react. Probably scared at first, too. But he's so all spry, so experienced. The guy's certainly not gonna lose it. He will say that everything will be fine, will support, as always, will smile his trademark smile, and Vanessa will immediately feel calm. Except Mark's reaction was very different. A child. The guy even recoiled from Vanessa. After hearing the news, what kind of baby would he be sure of? Surely 2 tests came back positive. This is such a bad time. You understand, don't you? Vanessa nodded. Of course, she understood everything perfectly. But what to do if this little man was already living under her heart? She felt frustrated and resentful. She thought Mark's reaction would be very different. The money for the abortion had to come from somewhere. The guy was talking to himself, as if to himself. Should I borrow it from Alex? Hearing the scary word, Vanessa was startled. What are you talking about? The girl instinctively grabbed her still absolutely flat stomach, as if protecting it. This was something she had never even thought of. Nico. Mark pulled himself together and spoke in a gentle yet firm voice. You realize we're not in a position to be parents right now, don't you? What can we give to this baby? Are we breaking bread for water right now? We're about to get our diplomas. You can go work construction. I'll get maternity pay. We'll manage. Vanessa thought it was Mark who would comfort her and say those very words. But as it happened, she had to take the initiative in her own hands. The news of the baby had thrown Mark completely off balance. Of course, he would later be ashamed of his cowardice, phrases. Nothing they never reproach him for them. Though it was certainly very hurtful to hear. Mark convinced Vanessa over and over again that they could not keep the baby. Painting depressing pictures of the future, he said he wasn't ready for such responsibility. And the girl suddenly, at some point, gives in to his persuasion. He's right about everything. They have no money. They haven't even learned yet. They're cramped in a small one-bedroom, and then there's the baby. The baby needs a lot of money, diapers, medicines, clothes, from which the infant grows at a breakneck speed. And she will not be able to work for a long time. When the child grows up and goes to the garden, no one will need such a specialist without experience. And she will have to throw her diploma on the shelf and work as a cleaner or a cashier in a supermarket. Is this the future we dreamed of? Mark asked. Are you worthy of more? Maybe I do need to see a doctor. Sadly, Vanessa sighed. After being carefully handled by the talented manipulator Mark, she had seen no other way out then. The guy's influence had worked. He had gotten his way. Good girl, shown Mark. We'll still have the baby. Don't worry. In a few years, we'll give him all the nice clothes, toys, his own room. But now is not the time. Vanessa called the clinic that same day and made an appointment for the procedure. Then she was in a desperate situation and thought she was doing everything right. In the morning, the girl went to the hospital with a heavy heart. In her bag, she had all the necessary things she had been told to take with her: slippers, gown, tape. Vanessa will have to spend the whole day in the hospital and will be released home only by evening. And that was if all was well. There was a line at the emergency room. Vanessa sat on a couch in the corner and looked at people for nothing. She was pounding. She could hardly contain her trembling. She wished Mark were there right now, holding her hand, stroking her back, assuring her that everything would be all right. But he was off on another part-time job. It's the right thing to do. They need the money, especially since they had to pay a large sum for this very procedure this month. Next to Vanessa sat a woman in her 40s. Well-groomed, beautiful, expensively and tastefully dressed. Exquisite manicure, fashionable haircut. Vanessa thought that she would like to look like that in 20 years, except that the woman's eyes were very sad. A man approached the woman. Probably her husband, a wealthy couple. Okay, I've done the paperwork. You'll be called soon. He put his hand on his companion's shoulder. Everything will be fine. For some reason, Vanessa immediately thought that this woman also wanted to get rid of an unwanted pregnancy. Her husband spoke the same words as Mark. It's gonna be okay. That's comforting. Really, why would they want people their age? The baby's probably an accident. In years before what could be okay, Vanessa's neighbor raised her eyes to her husband. What could be good about this whole situation? 11. Echo's fifth frozen pregnancy. Again, these painful procedures, treatment, recovery, and then all over again. You could see that the woman was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In the eyes of her companion was so much pain, so much sympathy. He did not know how to help his wife and what to say to her words, so he just hugged her. How stupid was I? Scared then that I cannot cope. I was just finishing school. University was ahead. A career. The woman was almost whispering. My son would be 24 years old now. I knew it was a boy. I felt it right away. And now I'm paying for that mistake for the rest of my life. It's my ass. I'm right not to have any more children. It's a punishment. The man continued silently soothing his wife, stroking her back, her hair, squeezing her palms in his hands. He could not find the right words. She didn't look at the adult couple, eyes wide. She understood everything from their short dialogue. Long ago, when they were high school students, This woman had a termination of pregnancy, and now she could not have children because of its consequences. She agonizes, worries, spends a lot of money and a lot of time to realize her dream of motherhood. But it doesn't work. Vanessa suddenly realized that she will never get rid of her baby boy. She already loves it, even though it's just a cluster of cells. That's what Mark called their baby when he insisted on aborting it. Vanessa is all grown up now. She's almost finished university. With her diploma in her pocket and Mark by her side. Vanessa is not alone. Together they'll make it. The girl ran out of the clinic as if chased by a pack of dogs. People looked at her in surprise. Once outside, Vanessa breathed a sigh of relief. She felt as if she had just escaped a great misfortune. Vanessa put her hand on her stomach and smiled. Her baby was with her, and that little girl. In that moment, Vanessa realized clearly that what she had under her heart was not a cluster of cells, but her daughter beloved, beautiful, healthy. They would meet in 7 months. Mark didn't like Vanessa's story, but it wasn't serious, he said flatly. I'll take you to the clinic tomorrow. You shouldn't have left. It was the first time they'd had an argument. Vanessa insisted on her own way. Mark was proving her wrong. His arguments had seemed so logical and right before. Now Vanessa wondered how she had ever agreed with them. Yes, it will be difficult for us. For a while, the girl said, but we're both very mature. We can handle it. I can't take that step. Finally, Mark slammed the door and walked out into the dark March evening. Vanessa thought he would cool down, come back with an apology. After all, Mark had always understood her so well before. The same would happen now. But Mark didn't show up until the morning. Drunk with aggression, he began to insist again that the child must be gotten rid of. I have a right to decide that too. And it's only Vanessa who concerns me. It was impossible to change her mind now. And the boy quickly realized that. He was a good judge of character. They hardly spoke to each other during this period. Vanessa asked the guy some questions, but he didn't dignify her with answers. He only came home to spend the night. And not always. Nico hoped that time would pass, and the man she loved would get used to the idea that he would soon become a father. Everything will be fine. Between them, after all, such a warm and close relationship. Of course, they will make up sooner or later. Mark will realize everything. He'll be ashamed. But one day, coming home from university, Vanessa found that Mark's things were not at home. The girl realized at once. She'd hoped in vain that her boyfriend would be supportive. She had wrongly thought that he just needed time to get used to the situation. Mark wasn't going to take responsibility for the baby. Nikon wasn't likely to love her that much either. Not at that moment. Much later, the girl suddenly realized that Mark had been using her. Living in her apartment. Rent in their city is not a cheap service. Mark's earnings were obviously not enough for such an expensive pleasure. Besides, no one took care of him, cooked for him, washed and ironed his clothes and cleaned. Mark lived on everything. This at first he amazed not his culinary talents and household network, but then the constant fatigue from the supposedly hard work and going out with friends. As if unnoticeably, Vanessa took the whole household on her shoulders and was happy that she was doing something for the person she loved. And yet Vanessa tried to find him. How is it? Gone, vanished, didn't even say goodbye. That's not right. Anyway, the baby Vanessa's carrying, the baby needs a father. But it turns out Mark's been a dropout for almost 2.5 years. That's the news. So Mark's been spending his time in the middle of school in the middle of nowhere. Wow, what a masterful liar he is. He was so convincing when he said he was going to his classes, but he wasn't. One of the guys from, hearing by chance that Nicholas would find out about Mark, approached her himself. You, Mark, are not looking for anything yet. He clarified. Vanessa nodded at him. Well, I thought so. It's a rare name. I don't think so. We've got a lot of Marks here. Tell me what happened. He was head over heels in love. Then he borrowed a nice sum of money and ran away. No, the shocked girl shook her head. He just disappeared. We lived together for almost 2 years. Everything was fine. We lived in your apartment, probably at your expense. I don't think he was paying for anything. Vanessa suddenly realized the guy was right. Mark earned, of course, from time to time, but he spent his money mostly on himself. Stylish clothes, gadgets. Vanessa bought occasionally inexpensive flowers or fruit baskets. The girl was so happy with this attention, and so happy that there was a favorite person next to her, that she simply did not notice the obvious. The guy's right. Mark has been living off her. If you look at the situation sober, something like that, but not quite. Not really. Mark still cooked the occasional nice dinner, fixed things around the house. Always wondered how Vanessa was doing. If so, according to the judge, he was giving something too, not just taking. Not really, the boy mumbled thoughtfully. Well, anyway, you're glad he's out of your life. He's an opportunist, a cleaning fish, a beggar from the village, unwilling to study and work, but dreaming of a beautiful life. From the outside, it was clearly visible how he sought to be friends with guys from wealthy families and daughters of rich parents, to pull resources from them. At first, he succeeded, but then everyone in tech realized who he was, and his tricks didn't work here anymore. But there's plenty of majors outside of college, so Mark went hunting elsewhere. And then he was expelled from here for failing grades. Vanessa flapped her eyes, trying to digest what she had heard. But I'm not the daughter of rich parents, quite the opposite. I have an apartment and no permanent source of income. Vanessa thought and nodded. There you go. I'm sorry, of course. But it's written all over your face that you're naive and inexperienced. It would be a piece of cake to fool someone like that. Mark had no place to live. Why are you picking on you? Lived a little in a safe harbor, not thinking about the fact that there's no money to pay the rent. Confidently, all the while he continued his hunt. Vanessa thought for a moment. Yes, indeed. Mark often disappeared with some of his friends, about whom the girl knew nothing at all. Maybe this guy was right. And now he must have found someone more suitable. So he's off into the sunset. A girl should be glad that this freeloader got away with poverty. And if suddenly, when he shows up after another failure, don't even let them on your doorstep. Here's my advice. Vanessa didn't believe this guy then because it was very hard to realize that the person you were so in love with wasn't who he pretended to be. Overcoming her natural shyness, Vanessa interviewed a few more people, choosing those who were older than high school seniors, practically graduates. And yes, some of them remembered Mark. They responded to the young man just as the first guy had. Vanessa returned home in shot feelings. It was like the ground had been knocked out from under her feet. Vanessa had a different picture in her head for 2 years. Beautiful, right. But it turns out Mark was using her. When he found out about the victim's pregnancy, the sneaky guy realized what he was up against. Liability for child support. A baby in a tiny one-bedroom. Problems for life, or at least for the first 18 years after the baby is born. Too expensive a price to pay for free housing and not so luxurious munchies. So he ran away. He's probably out of town by now. No one keeps Mark here. Then Vanessa thought about the baby, how she would raise it. Would she be able to handle it? The girl couldn't know that. But she realized one thing, even though her situation was desperate, this child would still be born to Vanessa. There wasn't a soulmate in the world. And here Vanessa's daughter felt that she was going to have a girl. Together, they would cope with all the troubles of life by themselves. And then there was a difficult, very difficult period. The diploma was the last responsible session of state exams. Vanessa studied like a curse from morning till night. She didn't think about Mark anymore. She just didn't have time. And then came the terrible toxicosis. Vanessa felt nauseous and confused. She felt dizzy all the time. But no one canceled her exams. And no one was going to make any favors for a pregnant student. Vanessa knew she had to get that diploma. She couldn't leave everything at the finish line, even though it was very hard to study in such a state. Vanessa was happy about one thing at the antenatal clinic, where she registered for pregnancy. She was told at every appointment that everything was going according to plan. The baby is healthy. It is developing as it should. These words of doctors encouraged the girl and warmed her soul. A few months flew by unnoticeably. The diploma is behind her. The state exams are passed on excellent. Vanessa is happy and proud of herself. She's done it. But what's next? The pregnancy was already past the first half. You could barely see the belly yet, so guessed slightly. But no one around had yet guessed that Vanessa was expecting a baby. The dean, after the defense of the diploma, unexpectedly invited the successful student to his office. Nico is a little surprised by this. She went up to the second floor and did not dare. Knocked on the door of the dean's office. "Come in." Vanessa saw Peter Sergeyevich behind the desk, always strict and serious. Now he was smiling broadly. Merry sparks sparkled in his eyes. "You are a wonderful student." So he began the conversation. "You have had good grades all the years, and you have performed well in the final tests. That's why I recommended that you be recruited from the factory. They need smart young economists. Do you know what the salaries are?" Of course, Vanessa knew. She never dreamed of ever getting a job there. Those who worked at the factory lived in huge new apartments and houses and drove expensive cars. In their town, the phrase factory worker even became a household name. It meant wealthy people who could not deny themselves anything. Vanessa even felt a little dizzy at the prospect, but then a daughter moved in her belly, bringing her mother back to earth. Who needs an employee without experience, who in a couple of months will go on maternity leave? It's easy to deceive, to hide a pregnancy nowadays. You can barely see your stomach, so there's no problem with that. But you'd still have to confess, hear a lot of accusations, set people up. Vanessa wasn't capable of that. Realizing that a dainty position was slipping away from under her nose, the girl almost cried. This job could solve all her problems in one fell swoop. Wanted to work. Really wanted to plunge into practice. Such was her fate. "Peter, I have something to tell you about this offer." Vanessa still had a faint hope that things would work out. Now the dean's gonna say that pregnancy is no big deal. Work for a couple of months, go on maternity leave, and then go back to the factory. They'll wait for such a promising economist. But the man, having heard the graduate's confession, gave a puzzled quack. That nothing can be done there. Is it a long-term or what? Just such offers happen once in a lifetime. It's a pity to miss the chance. Girl, you're a good economist. You'll make a great one. But I'm strapped for cash. You're needy. I can tell. I know your story, that's why I decided to help. Vanessa shook her head negatively. She understood everything the dean was saying. But there was nothing to be done. And the kid would never get rid of it for anything, even if she hadn't missed the deadline yet. The girl walked home and sobbed to her heart's content, paying no attention to the passersby regarding her. It was better that the offer had never happened. Such prospects, a completely different life. Was it hard to turn down a place like this? But she didn't want to cheat, and she didn't know how to set people up. It wasn't in her nature. In addition, Peter said that it would not have worked out for her, because when hiring a factory employee undergoes a medical examination, so it was just the way it was. She didn't calm down at home, she pulled herself together. She will have a baby, she needs to be strong. In addition, before the birth of a daughter must solve a lot of issues. The first is material. Now Vanessa will not receive a stipend to work. A girl who is about to go on maternity leave will not be taken either. But it's for a job in her specialty. And there are other positions. They do not require high qualifications, and sometimes even official registration. They don't pay much, but Vanessa needs something to live on. Not only that, just to live, she will have to save some amount of money, not to work during the period, when the daughter will be very tiny. Yes, the state provides some kind of allowance for children. Vanessa has already learned that it's a pittance. You can't live on that. And Vanessa is an honor student. She went to work as an entryway cleaner at the place where Mark used to work as a janitor. The girl ruled the stairwells in the early morning and late evening, when there were not so many people. The pay was good by Vanessa's standards. She had enough to live on and managed to save a little. Of course, the girl wasn't shocking. But after her grandmother was gone, she was used to saving money, so she didn't worry, especially about it. Physical labor suddenly turned out to be the best sedative, heavy, sad thoughts as if by themselves erased from her head. Vanessa even felt joy when instead of the dirty stairs, she saw the shining clean ground in front of her eyes. There was something soothing about it, even calming. At the same time, the girl was looking for earnings on the internet. She realized that she would not be able to wield a rag for long. The belly was growing by the hour, not by the day. It was simply impossible to hide it. And of course, it prevented her from bending over and stretching properly. And it was dangerous to carry a bucket of water. You never know. And Vanessa found another way to earn money, even more successful than the last one. And most importantly, a small child was not a hindrance. It turned out that hundreds of students across the country do not want to write term papers and essays on their own, download ready-made works. Not an option. Teachers have long known them by rote. Yes, and online verification greatly complicates the situation. Here came the demand for people who can write such works for money. They just could, and how could? She even breathed a sigh of relief when she realized that her university knowledge would help her in such a difficult situation. Vanessa quit her job because she could no longer clean entrances and went deeper into her new job, which she liked very much. The girl was afraid that during her maternity leave her knowledge would be forgotten, outdated, erased. But now she would be aware of everything that was happening in the economy. Vanessa worked and felt like pumping her professionalism. This, of course, could not help but please. The girl managed to collect enough money to prepare for her baby girl all the necessary diapers for the first time, and also bottles, overalls, decay race Vanechka. It turned out that the little man needs so much of everything. Vanessa even bought a stroller. Not a new one, of course. New ones cost like an airplane wing. She got it from a hand-me-down ad. Wonderful transportation for the princess tender pink stroller with beautiful flowers on the side. In excellent condition, by the way. In due time was born little Emily. When the baby was placed on Vanessa's chest in the hall, the young mommy even cried from the accumulated emotions. Now she is not alone. Now she is a mom. It is, of course, very difficult and responsible. But what a joy it is. Days in the maternity hospital with a little daughter turned out to be an incredibly happy time. She didn't have to work, she didn't have to clean or cook. She was invited to the canteen 5 times a day and was provided with clean diapers for her daughter every day. Beauty. Sometimes the girl would look out the window at the festive discharge parties thrown by new moms, relatives. Balloons, laughter, songs, fun, crowds, relatives, and friends. All of them joyfully welcoming the newest member of the family. Was asking mom for flowers. Vanessa smiled as she watched these scenes. But also sad, of course. No one is waiting for her like that. Only she herself is excited about Emily's arrival. But suddenly Vanessa was wrong. When the girl with such a pilot in her arms went to the porch of the maternity hospital, a small crowd was waiting for her there. A couple of classmates, a few coworkers. They were all smiling. There were flowers and balloons. Vanessa almost cried to the point of tears. The girl was put in a cab and sent home. Her friends walked her back to her apartment. Someone had to carry balloons, flowers, and packages with gifts for the baby. So Vanessa had a grand discharge, and then began the everyday life of a young mother. Nico got used to the new role as not as easy as planned before the birth. Sleepless nights, inexperience, unpredictability, her daughter's behavior, and fears. With the arrival of the baby, Vanessa has new fears that she could not even think of before. What if Emily chokes while feeding? What if the rash on the baby's body, a symptom of a terrible disease? Why is her daughter crying so much? Maybe she needs medical attention. And I had to work too, because the child's allowance seemed quite tiny. There were such moments when the young mother with one hand was nomadic daughter, and with the other hand was building another term paper, because the deadlines were pressing. Vanessa slept little during this difficult period. There was absolutely nowhere to wait for help. That's why she had to deal with the child herself, and to work, and to keep the house clean. After all, she had to go to the clinic and walk with the baby every day. Vanessa's skis slimmed down under her eyes. At that time, there were always deep shadows. She sometimes didn't even have time to sign out for the day. Curled her long tangled hair into a bump at the back of her head in the morning, hoping to tidy up her head a little later, and remembering it was past 0 o'clock. And yet, despite all these difficulties, no one has ever regretted their decision to keep the child. On the contrary, looking at her daughter, She was sometimes horrified at what she could do. After all, she had already come to the clinic, had already taken a coup, had already decided on a terrible deed. I wonder what would not have been heard than the conversation between that woman and her husband. Vanessa chased such thoughts away from herself. Now she did not even want to think about it. Emily grew up to be a calm, trouble-free child. Everything was on time, and her teeth grew when needed, and she sat up according to plan. And she went to school ahead of schedule. Vanessa had no one to talk to at home. She very much missed human contact and therefore constantly talked to her daughter. It is probably because of this that Emily spoke at an age when other children do not even try to say their first words yet. Moms on the playground, looking at the fictional cute little girl, amazed, and Vanessa's heart floods in joy and maternal pride. She has a wonderful daughter, the best. How lucky is she to have her? At the age of 2, Emily went to kindergarten. By the way, the girl very quickly got used to the new place of stay, no tears, no tantrums, as if the little girl understood that there was no other way out, and did not create unnecessary problems for her mother. Emily was not even sick during the period of adaptation, like other children. Realizing that the daughter is attached to a certain, took up the search for a job in her specialty. Earnings on the internet is, of course, good, but still the money is small and unstable. The young mother had to save on everything, and so wanted to buy toys and beautiful dresses for her daughter, and to pamper herself at least sometimes. Vanessa had studied for 5 years for a reason. It's time to look for a job in her specialty. No more red diploma on the shelf dusty. Of course, Vanessa encountered difficulties. An employee with no experience and with a small child in her arms. Now she's going to have to take endless sick days. We know you young moms. But my daughter attends the garden for a long time and does not get sick. There's no problem with that. You all say that, or you're not suitable for us. We need someone with experience. You can't handle it. Vanessa went to job interviews like she was going to work, and everywhere she went she was met with the same thing. It was confusing. Where can I get experience if they won't take me anywhere without it? Vanessa once approached a recruiter with a direct question. The woman who conducted the interview was confused for the first few seconds. That's not my problem. And yet one day luck smiled on a girl at a furniture repair company. An economist was urgently needed. The salary offered was not particularly large, so the queue of applicants for the position was not standing. And the person was needed right now. Vanessa was hired despite her lack of experience and the presence of a small child. There was no time for such subtleties. Vanessa quickly proved herself. She did her work faithfully. Everything had time and ideas to improve accounting. The girl finally got to work in her specialty. Management, of course, quickly appreciated her zeal. The young employee was respected. She even raised her salary. "We need such enthusiasts," the boss often said. Vanessa felt a pleasant warmth from these praises. A bonus to her favorite work and a good salary was communication, a team. Grown-up people. How did the girl miss all this? For 2 years, she talked only with her little daughter, and heard jokes, tea parties, exchanging news and opinions. All this was sorely missed. At the same firm, the girl met Jenna. They were almost the same age and therefore quickly became friends. Jenna often came to visit Vanessa and invited her to her house. The girl still lived with her parents. They had a lot of common topics for conversation. However, the friends' opinions on certain issues differed, which sometimes led to heated arguments. But it was also very interesting and exciting. Life got better. Vanessa worked, got good money. Now she did not have to save money on food and clothes. Vanessa even managed to save up for a summer trip to the sea with Emily. Luckily, the young mother had volunteered to go with them and Jenna. It was a wonderful vacation, which was then repeated several more times. Emily delighted in her successes. She grew up a beautiful girl, very much like Mark, but the character and learning abilities of the little girl went to her mother. Emily quickly and effortlessly learned to read, write, and count before school. She always went to kindergarten with a book. She also drew wonderfully. I could not be happy, but my treasure. But Jenna's friend didn't have a good personal life. She often went on dates, started light novels, and then shared with a friend over a glass of wine another disappointment. Maybe it's the men. Maybe they really are all assholes. Like yours. He left you with a potbelly and ran away. I don't know what to say. Vanessa shook her head. You know, I don't have much experience in these things. Maybe you're right, but Vanessa didn't really think so. She knew that there were many wonderful men in the world, kind, brave, caring. She just didn't want to argue with Jenna. She was already in a shooting mood. Of course, Vanessa sometimes thought about the fact that she needed a man next to her, a reliable shoulder, a support, a wall, behind which you can hide from the hardships of life, because pulling all alone, and it is very hard. There is no one to share her worries with. She herself would be happy to take care of this man, to surround him with love and care. And Emily would have a father who would be freaking out with her on the street and carrying the girl on his shoulders. Clearly that's not enough. Vanessa has seen the eyes her daughter uses to see off the father and little girl couples. She doesn't say anything out loud. She doesn't want to upset her mom, but Vanessa notices everything herself. But where to find such a prince? Yes, and when there's a house, a job, a daughter. Vanessa never went anywhere. Sometimes, of course, Jenna would take her out to a bar or a cafe. Emily was old enough to spend a few hours alone. But still, the woman's heart wasn't in the right place during those times. She kept thinking about how her baby was doing. I couldn't relax. What's wrong with you? Like a frying pan getting angry. Jenna, look at the way those cool guys at the next table are looking at us. They're gonna come over to meet us. You know, I should probably get going. You were always so touchy, Jenna. Whenever something interesting comes along, you just run. Jenna couldn't quite understand her friend. She hadn't had kids herself. She had no idea what it was like to worry about her blood daughter and the anxieties associated with a child she didn't know either. By the way, Jenna is still single. She has occasional stormy romances, but they all end the same way. The woman is once again disappointed in another cavalier, or he himself disappears over the horizon without explanation. When Andrew appeared in Vanessa's life, she at first did not even want to talk about it to her friend. She had just gone through a difficult breakup and was in her feelings. And here Vanessa is with her happiness. And the astute Jenna figured it all out. Are you seeing someone? Sort of. How did you know? Did your eyes give you away? Jenna grinned. Come on, tell me, who is he? How did you meet? Vanessa had to tell her friend everything. She didn't mind. I wanted to share the story with my friend. All the more so because it really turned out to be a fairy tale. Vanessa always came home at the same time. She would drive from work to school and pick up Emily from the after-school program. Together, they'd stop at the store for goodies. Then slowly, taking their time, they would take to their house. Mother and daughter shared the news of the day, discussed plans for the evening. It was wonderful. That was the time. That May evening. At first, it was business as usual. Emily was in a happy frame of mind. A long vacation, school camp, and a gift from her mother for the excellent completion of the first grade were ahead. The girl walked beside Vanessa and bounced with overflowing feelings. Vanessa smiled. She didn't even think of telling her daughter to have fun. And then a man approached them, handsome and young, his expensive branded clothes giving away his social status. He was looking directly at Vanessa and approaching her. There could be no doubt. Hello, a little confused by the young man's pronunciation. Don't be alarmed. I just don't know how to start a conversation. We need to talk. At least I do. I think it was getting. Emily looked at the stranger with curiosity, but without fear. The woman thought she was setting an example for her daughter. Not a good example. After all, so many times taught her not to talk to strangers and hear. But on the other hand, there was nothing to be afraid of. It's a busy street. Crowds of people going about their business. They're certainly not in any danger here. And this stranger evokes feelings other than fear or dislike. He's clearly embarrassed, though usually he's probably confident and self-sufficient. This behavior looks nice enough, and in general, an open look, a beautiful smile, a calm voice. Vanessa suddenly realized she was drawn to the end of it all. This is the kind of man you want to listen to. Maybe we should go to a cafe, the man suggested. I think the girl won't say no to ice cream. I won't refuse. Emily smiled at him. No, it's unnecessary, shook her head Vanessa. Realizing that the man did not know how to speak in front of a child of women, sent Emily to the nearest playground. Vanessa could see perfectly well what the daughter was doing. The girl was also peering at her mother, but she couldn't hear her conversation with the stranger now. So what did you want to talk about? The young man introduced himself as Andrew and then told her what the matter was. As he told her, Vanessa was surprised, pleased, and tried to hide a happy smile. She felt like the heroine of a romantic comedy. It turns out that Andrew is no longer in this cafe, every evening after work, and the walls there are transparent from thick backstage glass. A man, understandably during dinner, stares out into the street. In his field of vision are people hurrying about their business in the evening. And then one day he saw Vanessa and her daughter. Easy gait, a kind look. You looked at your daughter with such tenderness and looked like the Madonna and Child from the ancient paintings. I don't know how to explain it. Andrew was embarrassed and confused. But Vanessa, of course, she understood what the man was trying to say. Don't think anything of the sort. It's just that, as I understand it, you're single now, unmarried, and we can try, well, to meet, to go for a walk somewhere to socialize. I'm raising my daughter alone, that's true. But how did you figure that out? I just assumed. Andrew smiled broadly. It was obvious that Vanessa's admission that she was single pleased him very much. No ring on her finger. Besides, I've never seen you with anyone. Just you and your daughter. I've been watching you for a long time. That may sound frightening, but don't think I won't, the man assured Vanessa. Her heart fluttered joyfully and goosebumps ran up and down her back. The woman tried very hard not to show her feelings and hoped she was succeeding. You already know here, Emily and I pass by at this time every day. No wonder you see us all the time. Andrew smiled again. Yes, you're right. That's exactly how it worked out. When I see you, it makes me feel so happy, so warm. Well, now that I've said it out loud, that's why I decided to talk to mine. I think you're a wonderful person. Not many people like you. And of course, you're very beautiful. Vanessa couldn't help smiling. It had been so long since she had been complimented. It had been so long since she had felt herself admirable and loved. It was incredibly gratifying. Then the conversation flowed, somehow more naturally. Unnoticeably, Vanessa and Andrew switched to you. The man was no longer embarrassed or lost. He told a little about himself and asked Vanessa a few questions about his life. The bonding happened naturally and easily. A little later, Emily, who was playing on the playground, joined them on the bench. She diffused the situation even more with her childlike directness. As it happened, Emily and Andrew immediately found a common language. And then there were meetings, dates, sometimes with Emily, sometimes without her. Vanessa was afraid to believe that she had finally met her man. Andrew understood her, accepted and respected her opinion, and was always ready to offer help. Vanessa felt that if she turned to him with any problem, and he would solve it immediately and with the joy of being able to help. Of course, there were doubts. The story of Mark was still fresh in her mind. Though it had been many years since then, Andrew was younger. He holds a high position in a large company. His parents are very wealthy after all. Do they need a daughter-in-law like that? And Andrew himself. The man is rich, handsome, virtually flawless. He must have a lot of admirers around him, and the man wasn't exactly hiding it. Of course, I've met many women, but you're different from all of them. You're the best, sincere and honest, a little naive and gentle. There's probably no one like you anymore. I was lucky to meet you by chance. From these words, she already loved Andrew with all her heart and felt that he had no less strong feelings for her. But Vanessa still could not believe that a long and serious relationship between them was possible. People around them were adding fuel to the fire, especially Jenna Master. Disappointment with men. Those rich ones, they're always looking for someone. I've had stories like that. James, for instance. Do you remember him? Probably a businessman with a cool car. He sang in your ear, "I love him, I can't do it." Caught him, dumped him, dumped him. married his father's partner's daughter. The usual story. Don't get your hopes up either. It can be painful. But things didn't work out the way Jenna had predicted. Andrew made some sort of proposal. He looked into her eyes with such concern as she was confused with surprise. What to say? Andrew then thought Vanessa was formulating a polite refusal. He himself had admitted it to her later. But the woman, she just didn't know what to do because she was confused and because she had the attitude firmly planted in her head. They're not a couple. I love you very much, Vanessa finally said. But you won't regret it later. I mean, we're not exactly equals. And I have a daughter, Do you really think so? Andrew marveled, and then he held Vanessa tightly to him. I love you. I don't need anyone else. I am happy that I noticed you once. It's the greatest gift of fate. Vanessa was bursting then with joy and surprise at the touching essence of the situation itself. It was nice to feel so valued and loved. Well, your parents won't mind. Only now I realized my omission, Andrew smiled. I should have introduced you to them a long time ago. Then such questions would not have arisen in principle. Andrew's parents turned out to be incredibly nice and smiling people. They welcomed Vanessa and Emily so warmly that the woman had no doubts. Andrew was not lying. He really wants to be her spouse. They're going to be fine. Children are a great happiness. Anna smiled. Andrew's mom looked at Emily fondly. She is so beautiful. You have a very good girl. Emily was reciprocating Andrew's father and mother with affection. If Vanessa was at first shy in the company of her mother-in-law, her 7-year-old daughter immediately found a common language with them. She needed her grandparents so much. Anna and Sam had long dreamed of grandchildren. And then there was the wedding. Not a lavish celebration with a lot of guests, but a small family holiday. It was what both the bride and groom wanted. After the newfound family, Vanessa, Andrew, and Emily flew to the warm sea. It was a wonderful joint vacation full of sun, fun, pleasant surprises. And then family life began in Andrew's big apartment. The life as quickly settled down. Everything went in its own way. After only a couple of months, it seemed that it was always like that. 2 years after the wedding, the family was enriched with 2 new members. Vanessa gave birth to twins. Frank and Peter were so funny, so cute. They quickly became everyone's favorites. Anna, Vanessa's mother-in-law, loved taking care of the babies. The happy grandmother came to the apartment of the young family almost every day to help her daughter-in-law. 2 babies at once. It's no joke. She was often accompanied by Sam's husband. That too did not dote on the children and constantly invented some fun games. When Grandpa came to visit, there was always squealing and laughter in the apartment. Vanessa enjoyed these visits. Andrew turned out to be not only a wonderful husband, but also a caring father. And the man made no distinction between Emily and his sons. He paid equal attention to all of them. Time passed, the boys grew up and went to kindergarten. Vanessa was finally able to return to work. Of course, there was no need for money as before. But the woman loved what she was doing. Besides, she liked the team and socializing. She did not want to become a housewife at all, although Andrew had suggested it many times. Vanessa explained her decision to her husband, and he, as always, understood her. She and Andrew have been together for 6 years now, and these years have changed Vanessa a lot. She became more calm, more feminine, more peaceful. How could it be otherwise when you're with a man you never even dreamed of? He's so unbelievably good at everything. But now Vanessa suddenly runs through the streets of the city after her ideal husband, who apparently is in a hurry to meet his mistress. The woman did not believe Jenna's words when she said that she had seen Andrew several times in a cafe with a spectacular lady. Vanessa felt sorry for her friend. She so desperately wanted what she herself had for a husband. Children, a strong family. Vanessa knew that Jenna was a little jealous of her and thought her words about Andrew were either fiction or a mistake. But here he was, Andrew, strangely dressed, unshaven, very tired, going on and on when he should be at home with the baby. Here, at last, is the restaurant. The man walked in there, didn't wait for a while so he wouldn't run into his husband at the door. Then he slipped into the establishment as well. The woman chose the far corner, a table bookmarked with a palm tree. You can hardly see her there. It's a cozy vantage point. But Andrew, Vanessa's husband, was seated at a table against the opposite wall, far enough away to hear his conversation, but well enough to observe. And yes, Andrew was not alone at the table. He was already being waited on by her, the same blonde to whom Jenna had spoken. She wasn't wrong, it turns out. Indeed. The girl is quite attractive and looks at the man so attentively, so enthusiastically tells him something. And Andrew answered with a one-word look at the interlocutor, nodding with interest in time with her words. His eyes remained very anxious. Probably he was reporting to his mistress how his life with his wife and 3 children was late for him. Maybe even complaining that he had to carry someone else's child. All the complexes and stereotypes are not once tortured. Suddenly, again stirred up, raised their heads, and desperately jealous Andrew to this talkative beauty, and also hurt that those around him, including Jenna, were right. Never a man like Andrew would be happy with a woman like her Vanessa. He'd need someone brighter, more presentable like this blonde. Andrew suddenly hung his head, as if hearing something sad or frightening. The blonde put a hand on his shoulder gently and soothingly and gestured. The man covered her palm with his. They smiled at each other. Her eyes darkened at this point from her overflowing emotions. If it had been possible to write off this conversation as a business conversation before, it was definitely not. Andrew suddenly rose from his seat and moved toward the smoking room. That seemed strange too. Andrew, after all, never smoked and generally adhered to a healthy lifestyle. Nothing had escaped his spouse. Now she'll talk to him, ask him about the blonde. Vanessa doesn't intend to wait for tonight. And in such a situation, the man is confused, will not be able to come up with an excuse or lie to the effect of surprise. When he saw Vanessa, Andrew glanced at her indifferently at first. Something was wrong with him. Something subtly unfamiliar slid into the features of the man he loved. Was he so changed by the company of his mistress? And how could he remain so calm when he saw his wife at this very moment? Vanessa to the railing, into the man's angry gaze. Andrew raised his eyebrows in surprise, gazing into her face, and suddenly there seemed to be a flicker of understanding in his eyes. It was as if he remembered Vanessa and recognized her at last. The situation was becoming more and more incomprehensible. Andrew, can you explain to me what is going on here? Vanessa herself did not expect her voice to shake from the tears coming to her eyes. You must be Vanessa. Andrew smiled embarrassedly, or the woman, only now noticing the old deep scar on this man's temple and the tattoo on his arm. The man also seemed to be thinner than Andrew. Who are you? Vanessa breathed out. She shook. She grabbed the ledge of the wall to keep from falling. The man immediately and carefully supported her. His movements, his facial expressions, his facial features. Everything was exactly like Andrew's, and yet it wasn't him. Now that Vanessa was right next to him, she could see it clearly. It was probably for the best. It's probably for the best. The man smiled. I didn't know how to tell you about myself, even though I've been looking for you for almost a month. How? I've been living in your town all this time. Nina and I. She's a private investigator, by the way. She's the one who helped me with this search. She and I have been gathering evidence and proof. There's no doubt now. Now comes the hard part. Familiarity. I don't get it. It's not surprising. The story is so unique in its own way. Any indie movie could top it. I thought you were my husband. It's understandable. Andrew and I are natural copies of each other, twin clones. My husband is the only child in the family. Vanessa weakly objected. If Anna and Sam had other children, they would have told us about it. Vanessa knew it had taken the older couple a long time to become parents. Andrew is a very late and long-awaited child, and he was born alone. I suggest we go to the table. Victoria and I will tell you all about it there. I nodded weakly. The blonde flicked her eyebrows down in surprise at seeing Vanessa. But Nina apparently recognized her. At least, she immediately addressed Vanessa by name. This is a really incredible story, Nina said. It will change your spouse's life and yours, of course. It was Nina who began the story. A man who looked uncannily like Andrew, whose name, as it turned out, was James. Every now and then he'd insert his lines, add to it, correct it. In distant New York lived a large family of mom, dad, and 4 children. Neither education nor parental support the couple had. All their property was a 2-room apartment in a dilapidated 2-story barracks on the edge of town. It was a wooden structure, shriveled by time, an emergency dwelling. But the large family had no other home in sight. There was a catastrophic lack of money. The head of the family worked part-time where he could. Who is to garden about the flight? Who will help to re-roof? Somewhere he unloaded a truck at the store, in a word, a handyman. In the morning he would go out in search of a living. And in the evening he often came back drunk, but without money. The mother of the family hardly worked. She had no time to be pregnant or with another baby on her hands. Is it a joke? For 6 years of life together, the couple managed to produce 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. It would seem quite enough, given the initial conditions. Too much even. But the mother of many children had a different opinion. First of all, the children were paid an allowance. Secondly, having a baby in her arms, she could legally not work. Her husband all dreamed that when the younger wife will grow up to help him in making money for the family. But his other half had other plans. And in general, the woman loved children, especially when they are very small, touching, visiting as kittens, who glasses that smell so nice. Well, how to refuse herself this pleasure? In general, contrary to the aspirations of the head of the family, got pregnant his fella in the 5th time to trick around his finger on something safe days. Women can when they want. The spouse came to despair when he learned that he would soon become a father again. Pulling another one was too much. And then there were suspicions that there was more than one child under his wife's heart. That is suspiciously fast-growing belly this time. The mother of many children did not go to the ultrasound. There was no money, and she didn't register early, only to fray nerves in vain to go to the counseling center. No, she was an experienced lady. She knew that the most convenient way to surrender to doctors is on the eve of childbirth. But experienced acquaintances unanimously assured twins. The old lady on the 1st floor was a former midwife. It was 2 heads in the belly of the pregnant woman felt twins. I'm telling you exactly, authoritatively declared the neighbor. I am never wrong. The woman smiled happily, and her husband grabbed his head. There are twins here too. At that time, the father of many children found a good part-time job, tending the bushes in the house of a wealthy businessman, Chuck. Every dog in town knew him. He owned a chain of restaurants and cafes. The man was lucky enough to get a seasonal job with him. Paid well, no hard feelings. The work was not dusty, simple. And what a magnificent house. And the garden was a pleasure to work in. People live, but she didn't look happy to be rich. And the new gardener quickly found out why. Turns out, the couple couldn't become parents, couldn't make it work, and there were some problems with the wife's health. The father of many children chuckled to himself. His husband would have such problems. Businessman this where only his wife did not take his wife, where she only did not treat. And no good. And this, it turns out, happens. One day the wife of the owner could not stand it and burst into tears right in the garden. Chuck clumsily consoled her, tried to find words. That's when the father of many children and the idea arose in his head. He waited until Chuck was alone and approached him with a proposal. You're having a baby. It's not working out. I got 4 on the bench. I got twins on the way. What are we going to do with them? We can't afford them. So maybe we'll give you the kids at a fair price. My wife's not registered with the doctors, so the babies don't even exist on paper. What do you think? Chuck was outraged at first, yelled at the gardener. But a couple days later, he called him in for a serious talk. It turned out that the businessman discussed the proposal with his wife, and she happily jumped at the chance to become a mother of newborn twins. That evening, the head of the family returned to his home barn in high spirits. He would make such a bargain and get rid of unwanted children and earn money. Besides, at least one of his descendants would have a human life. The man was even a little jealous of the unborn twins. Lucky kids. But his wife suddenly resisted giving the children away. They are my relatives. I feel them and I'm already waiting for them. I won't give my kids to anyone. Let them take them from the orphanage. Children in orphanages are alcoholics and sick people. They don't need them. We have babies. They're just beautiful. And then, what will these kids see in our place? And there's such a house, so much money. But the woman is stubborn. She wouldn't do it. Except her husband wasn't about to give up his plan. He told Chuck about the problem, saying that his wife did not want to part with the children. She was not even ready to give up one child. And then the businessman voiced a plan, which was under the power of only such an influential and rich man. At the due date of the young woman, in the local maternity hospital, 2 boys were born. The mother was a little surprised. There was something special about her. In the past, no one ran around like this in front of her. And here's so much attention, so much care. I guess it's because she's having twins. The babies are weak, anxiously, shook her head, the doctor. We need to get them to the NICU. Don't worry, the midwife reassured her. It's twins. With twins is always so. Everything will be fine. But the midwife was wrong. In the morning, the mothers of many children brought only one son to feed. The second. He hadn't survived the night, she was told. In fact, the baby was handed over to the Chuck family. This was the plan that Sam had proposed to the father of many children. That same night, Anna also arrived at the maternity hospital. Allegedly, she was going into labor. No one was to guess that the baby wasn't hers. They were discharged on the same day. The woman from the back barn and Chuck's wife. One was greeted by her husband and older children happy with the successful outcome of the event. The other had a grand discharge with music, balloons, guest photographers. Only a very limited circle of people knew about the fact that the babies these women were holding in their arms were twin brothers. And they kept quiet, because each of these people received a tidy sum and warnings. That's how it turned out. Nina finished the story. Andrew, by fate, fell into Chuck's family. James stayed with his blood relatives. Not for long, though. After a couple of years, all the children were removed from the family by the child welfare authorities. At that point, James was already an older brother. There was another girl born after him. So I grew up in an orphanage, James continued. I wouldn't say that my childhood was very hard. We had a nice, quiet life. Raised. We were educated. I graduated from the College of Mathematics and Computer Science. Now I work as a programmer. I have a family in the capital. A wife, 2 kids, an apartment. Everything is as it should be. Vanessa flapped her eyes, looking at James. That's the story. Really, it was like a fairy tale. How would Andrew feel about it? Good thing she'd found out. First, to prepare a spouse. It'll be a real shock to him. And the mother-in-law. They're old people. They need to be told too. A little more gently. Vanessa couldn't quite figure out how to feel about Andrew's parents' behavior. On the one hand, it was immoral and illegal. On the other hand, her husband was living in royal conditions, not wandering around in orphanages, and the childless couple was happy that they finally had a child. My mother visited me at the orphanage, James continued sometimes. I guess it was true that she loved children, she just wasn't a very responsible parent. She brought me cheap caramels, stroked my head. We didn't starve in the orphanage, of course. But I waited for these visits and caramels like manna from heaven, because it is important for every child to know that he is loved. And then I became an adult and independent. I didn't quit either. I helped her a little with money and tried to treat her. She drank heavily. Her father died a long time ago when she was young and her mother was stronger. But James couldn't perform a miracle to change his mother. All he could do was support her and watch her. As she sank, she lost her humanity. One day, the woman became seriously ill. Her liver started to fail. Not surprisingly, James visited her in the hospital, bought the necessary drugs, but the doctors did not give a single chance. It was a matter of days. The old woman realized this, and one day she told her son, the only one of her children who did not leave her this story about twins, a rich family of a child from this wealthy, childless couple. The husband once still revealed the truth to his wife after another feast explained where he suddenly got a large amount of money. More than 20 years had passed since that moment, so the woman was not particularly impressed, but she remembered, of course, her husband's story. She was even happy for her son, who now lives like a prince and knows no need. She praised her spouse for such a decision. The mother wanted to find Chuck's family just to have a look at the second twin. But the businessman and his family, almost as soon as they got the baby in their arms, they went elsewhere. Chuck sold his business, his house, his possessions, and just kind of disappeared. As I found out, later he started a new life in a distant city, bought a completely different business, settled in a new place. I mean, right here. It's just incredible. Vanessa was experiencing a mixture of all kinds of feelings: surprise, joy, anxiety, and relief. Relief that Andrew was faithful to her. She'd been imagining things, but what shock was in store for the whole family? Andrew? I'm sure he'll be thrilled to hear the twins' news. He's dreamed of having a brother since he was a little boy. It's the one wish his parents never got to fulfill. That's what I said when I heard my mother's story. She was gone the next day, by the way. If she had kept quiet then, she would have taken the secret with her. As it was, I now knew I had a twin brother and intended to find him at all costs with other siblings. I kept in touch all the time. They are all decent, people grown and educated, with families. And the twin brother, your exact replica, your natural clone, is a different story. James hired a private investigator. She got to work and very quickly got on Chuck's trail. It wasn't hard. The girls smiled. They moved away from Andrew's blood family, of course, but they didn't try very hard to cover their tracks. I found them quickly, and so we've been here for a month now. James smiled, looking around and gathering the latest evidence that this wasn't a mistake. Although the main evidence here is Andrew's success, we're practically identical. Even you and your spouse didn't realize what was going on right away. The final proof is ready. There's no mistake. The next step is introducing the brothers. That's the step James is hesitant to take. 9 aside. And all of a sudden it just happened all by itself. Well, Vanessa smiled. So we'll all have a celebratory dinner tonight. I'll be home at 7. I need time to get Andrew ready, so come by at 8 o'clock. You know the address, of course. I'm sure you do. James shone.
Subscribe and click the bell.
After the deepening heat, uncharacteristic of May, flooding the streets of the town with a golden, soulful wave of fresh coolness, coming from the dark gray stone of the Catholic Church, the first of which, as legend had it, was laid by the same architect who had once built Notre Dame de Paris, Stephen was literally dizzy and lingered in the aisle, almost tripped, grasped the back of the pew with his hand, and took a deep breath. "Young man, are you feeling ill?" A certain old woman, Mrs. Justin, you ducked out from behind him, looking empathetic and sympathetic. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Stephen forced a smile and stepped back, half a step to let the old lady pass. Mrs. Justine, thanking, levied the case forward, her head in a bonnet. Goose powder and silk ribbon roses bobbed, like a flag sailing a royal frigate. And at last it fell silent as Mrs. Justin sank into a pew in the front row, a seat she had been accustomed to occupy for more than half a century. Stephen settled down in one of the back rows, wrote, and was glad that no one was sitting next to him, because right now he was dying to be alone. But he had come to church because he couldn't do otherwise, because otherwise he just couldn't take it anymore. The priest, Father Stewart, appeared up front, and the sermon began. In general, Stephen could not call himself a deeply religious man. To be more precise, he had forgotten the last time he had been in such a place or turned to the Almighty. But today he was in dire need of consolation and absolution, because suddenly everything in his life, seemingly settled and more or less bearable, had gone wrong, and the nightmares of the past, the ones he had hoped had been buried long ago, had returned. They came again, and it would seem that he woke up, washed his face, brushed it off, and lived the whole day easily and happily. But the bad dreams, reminding him of all he had done, came tenaciously, and after them Stephen walked like a man out of his mind, and everything fell out of his hands, and in his head replayed those episodes of reality which he longed to forget. Stephen covered his eyes and, folding his hands, tried to listen to what the Holy Father was saying. Not just to listen, but to hear, letting the meaning of each word pass through him. And he was ready to beg anyone, and at any price, if only relief would come, if only they would help him. Stephen did not remember his childhood in Russia. His mother had taken his 3-year-old baby boy and, ignoring the exhortations of relatives, had followed her husband to Ireland. Stephen's father belonged to the Russian community, which seems to have been formed on the Emerald Isle in the 20s of the last century. And then one day, coming as a tourist to his distant ancestor's hometown, he met Adriana. Then he went to Dublin to work, and after a while she announced that she was pregnant. The man was in shock, but did not refuse the family circumstances and began, first, to send money regularly, and secondly, to prepare the papers for the move. And the first memory that was printed in little Stephen's mind was the call home. He cradled the cat so that it blushed the telephone receiver and clapped. "Grandma, I love you. But that's it. That's enough." Mother snatched the receiver from Stephen's hands and, throwing a few angry words into it, hung it up. Somewhere it was like being glued. Next to that memory was another. Stephen playing with a white teddy bear and a fire engine, and then leafing through a book of fairy tales with wonderful and three-dimensional pictures of Ivan the Tsarevich riding a gray wolf through dark forests. All these were gifts to her grandmother from Russia. She never forgot her daughter or her grandson. "I hate you," shouted Stephen in the face of his mother when she announced that she did not. They will not fly to the funeral of grandmother because there is no money. And right on the same day, by the way, Adriana lost all the monthly allowance she received as an unemployed person at the races, and with the second allowance, which was for the child, she bought booze. Bottles clattered on the table, mixed with cans with hidden iron edges and stubble. Canned goods, some of which already smelled bad. Male and husky memorized voices sounded in the room. Mother had visitors again. "We should teach him a lesson." One of the men ventured and tried to grab the 10-year-old by the scruff of the neck. But Stephen dodged and rushed away from the room and the apartment in general with a nose full of tears. And then, sitting on the steps of their brick house, showed himself heartily. He already understood well what death was, and understood even better that now the last and generally the only person dear to him had disappeared. As for his father, he had passed away 4 years after they had moved to Ireland. But Adriana clung to the possibility of living abroad tightly and completely dismissed the possibility of returning home. True, she did not have a good knowledge of the language of indecent profession, but it was possible to receive all sorts of benefits, and the Russian community helped a little. Earlier, the move helped Stephen to adapt rather quickly, learn the language, and generally get into the environment. But at the same time, he also adored his native language and was often sad about the fact that fate had ordered his person in such a way. He often thought that if only his mother had not left, things would have been different. Maybe he wouldn't have slept. Would the family have held him back? By the time Stephen turned 16, his mother had gone completely downhill. The boy tried to spend a minimum of time at home, and the place where they lived. Now, it was hard to call home, because after the death of her husband, Adriana sold his small but decent apartment. And with the proceeds of the money, Rats lived in an apartment the size of a room that her mother had bought with the leftovers. And through the paint, you could see the wallpaper that the previous tenants had put up. It must have been in the 30s. "You've ruined my whole life," Stephen had said more than once. But his mother only grinned at him and threatened him with her finger. "Look, I was spinning. And I live abroad. My girlfriends must have been jealous of how they were in our province. I live abroad with my son." That's what my mother used to say. I entered the surrounding space with my hand with such a proud look, as if it was the palace of the Queen of England. At school, Stephen was one of the laggards. He also got mixed up with bad company. But in those years of his youth, these guys seemed cool to him. Outcasts of the common man's society, these obscure rebels. They hung around all day drawing on the walls, composing music or poetry. Stephen realized too late that the police knew his group by name for a reason. This group of honeyed youths from the suburbs were into petty theft. They also stole cars and acted as couriers to deliver things. "Brother, help me out." One night, when the streets are foggy, Stephen asked Jamie for help. The guy from this company can't get busy himself. His girls promised a date, you know. Hand it over. And Jamie handed his comrade a small package. "I can still pay," Jamie added with a pleading tone in his voice, seeing the man's hesitation. "Don't be so forward. There's plenty of money here. Where should I carry it?" Stephen asked. And Jane was terribly relieved, instructed him. But something went wrong. That night, Stephen was apprehended by the police. I mean apprehended. After a heart-pounding, fox-like chase. But Stephen wasn't running from them. He didn't know exactly what he was running from. But he was very scared. As for the arrest, the thing was that a policeman identified Stephen as the man who had removed the car stereo the day before. The teenager was taken to the station. And there, by chance, on the same day, several other gang members were arrested, and those whom he considered his friends willingly told about everything Stephen had done with them. Because in this way, they could at least make amends for their own guilt, showing, so to speak, conscientiousness and willingness to cooperate. And from those conversations, Stephen learned that Jamie had died, hit by a car. Stephen thought it would be all right. He waited for his mother to come and bail him out. She was promised she'd be notified, but no one showed up. And the kid, before he even realized what was happening, he ended up behind bars, in a special facility for juvenile delinquents. And the days flew by. Stephen was shocked, terrified. But, as is typical of human nature, over time, he became accustomed to the circumstances, not just resigning himself to it, getting used to it. And when he was released the day after his 18th birthday, he was confused. What to do now? His mother visited him in prison only once, but not to encourage him, to comfort him. She was interested in one thing, whether Stephen had any stash of something left. And then she said he was an idiot because normal sons take care of their mothers. They're behind bars. She left, and after almost 2 years, Stephen had to go back to their apartment. There was nowhere else to go, so he did. His mother was found on the floor, fallen out of her wheelchair. During this time, she had managed to poison herself with logs, whiskey, broken legs, and was not treated. But despite everything she had been through, she continued to drink. "Sonny's back," Adriana whispered through what was left of her teeth and reached for the bottle. Actually, because she couldn't reach it. That's why she fell over. "Help," she called, looking at the bottle. Mother lifted his mother up, and he almost threw up. He'd met homeless people on the streets, of course. This was how they would live with a cold. The windows closed, the air alcoholic and stinky. There's a mountain of garbage on the floor, leftovers rotting on the table, furniture, appliances, everything that used to be of any value has been sold off. "What is this?" Stephen asked, taking a paper from the table. It was some kind of document, and his heart, a bad feeling. And that's the mother behind him gurgling to suck the leftovers out of the bottle. "A bargain," she laughed. "And I thought nobody wanted our Villain." "What are you talking about?" Stephen frowned. This little apartment was certainly not the best real estate in Dublin. It was on the outskirts, in a house that needed renovation. But what Stephen heard next shocked him. It turned out that Adriana had sold some people their only home, sold it supposedly for cash. What had it gone for? Stephen knew exactly. And also for exchanging that apartment for some country house, a cottage in the suburbs. The kid exclaimed, "Mom, are you out of your mind? You can't get that much for our apartment." Well. He nervously leafed through the pages of the confusing contract. In general, Stephen was not a real estate expert, but he realized when he saw the numbers. His mother had sold the apartment for 1/10 of its real value. There was also the address of the new property that these realtors had bought for her. "It's time to move out," he mumbled, "but his mother is in a hurry." They say if I don't eat, the police will come. Stephen was breathing heavily, choking on anger, resentment. He realized his mother had been a victim of fraud, but there was probably nothing he could do about it. Where are you going? Get some groceries. I'm starving. Drunk. His mother shouted after him as Stephen jumped out of the apartment. The rest of the day, the guy spent trying to understand the situation at the place specified in the contract, as the address of the office was a small office, where he was told that everything is normal. The deal is fair. And anyway, what claim does the young gentleman have if he had no rights to that housing? When Stephen went to the police, they listened to him carefully and said that they could not help because the deal was legal. So you can, of course, go to a lawyer, the elderly officer advised, but take into account the case risks dragging on for years. In addition, it will cost about several tens of 1,000 euros. By evening, it was drizzling rain. Stephen returned home. He realized it was the end, but he was also brutally determined. Pack up, he told his mother. I'll take you home. The thing was that on the way back, Stephen had time to find out what was at the address given in the contract. So he made a decision. He helped his mother gather the few things that were left in her pockets. It was empty, which meant there was no money for a cab. They took the bus first. Passengers interceded, fussed. Stephen could understand them. His mother didn't seem to have washed him for a long time. Hey, let me help you, said a stout-looking man. Looks like a laborer, and he helped him lower Adriana out of the bus. Stephen thanked him. They walked the rest of the way. Or rather, he walked to break the cauldron ahead. Here, the poor neighborhoods ended and the industrial zone began. And then they were at the city dump. The authorities had long promised to make the place look decent, but they had never gotten around to it. That's why there are a few barracks, built in the 40s for refugees from the continent. 2 of the 3 barracks were completely abandoned, with boarded-up windows and doors. One of them was still alive, where the homeless lived, and there, according to the contract, was Adriana's new accommodation, a room on the first floor with a broken window and a failed floor. There was nothing here, but technically the barracks was still listed on the documents as real estate. Here we are, Stephen said. He allowed himself a wicked smile as Adriana began to realize how she'd been duped. Son. The older woman's lips trembled. How am I here? Don't leave me, son. She reached up to him, her hands all delicately veined, arthritis excluded fingers. Did you choose this life for yourself? Stephen's back was turned. You're not my mother anymore, and I don't care if you die here. You drunk, you creep, he shouted, with a shower of tears, and then, turning around, threw himself away. He didn't care. He did it. Nearly 10 years have passed since that day. Stephen hadn't lived in Dublin for a long time. He had left it, having once bought a bus ticket to the west coast of the island with the money he earned. A lot has happened since then. Stephen worked on fishing boats, worked on a farm growing potatoes and cabbages. He's been a builder, a driver. Basically, he did the best he could. He didn't aspire to anything. He understood that a man, especially if he has nothing behind him, has no family support or financial base, for example, in the form of an inheritance, that such a person should try twice as hard to stand firmly on his feet and not let his life go down the drain. But the years flew by, and Stephen still lived as if today. And so fate brought him to this small resort town. Stephen was not a great fan of classical English and Irish literature, but it seemed to him that it was from such towns that Dickens, Austen, and others had written off the characters for their novels. Time seemed to stand still here, the abundance of greenery, the unhurried rhythm of life. Stephen worked on a construction site, or rather, was among the workers who built the house and had to perform finishing work. Although, in Stephen's opinion, taking into account the size and layout of the house, it turned out to be a whole mansion. Working here was interesting from a professional point of view, as well as profitable. Oh, that. And then clapped Stephen on the shoulder. Suddenly he jumped up, turned around and looked at another worker. I didn't know you were a believer, Matt remarked. I just came in for a moment. Stephen smiled guiltily. I just wanted to, of course. He couldn't say that he had a guilty conscience and felt that he couldn't live another day without taking away his sins. More specifically, his major sin of the past. I understand, Matt nodded. Mine are sick. Corey, can you believe it? I thought they were vaccinated. The mayor complained about his family's difficulties. He and his wife had 5 kids. Mary says it's our punishment for missing Sunday Mass. What can we do? We've got a vegetable garden to plant. You're the one who's been complaining about Matt's life. I was the one who talked him into it. I said, let's not go all the way to town. Let's just do things in the garden. So she agreed. Especially since my average Johnny, he stole watercolor paints and decided to paint his sister's dresses. Can you believe it? Matt choked on the bag, and Mary was washing, ironing, laying out for the girls so the dolls would show up for Mass. So anyway, I sinned and my Mary cursed. Matt sighs. I got it too, says Johnny. All over me. So that's how we didn't go. So why aren't you in your parish? Stephen asked, just to be polite and keep the conversation going, because his thoughts were far away from the story of his acquaintance's life. Well, is it not a good deed? He came in. Can I ask where you live? He doesn't ask, Matt shrugged. It's just that I'm in town all day today. I have to go to the drugstore, then to the supermarket, to the suburbs. I'll be back tonight. I already went to church. That means I did the right thing. Do you think it'll help my family? Matt finished, pathetically. It will, Stephen replied, thinking that it probably wouldn't help him. Or maybe it wouldn't help at all. Some auntie from the front pew spoke up for them and, turning around, flashed her eyes. This isn't your priest. Are you here for the temple? I'm sorry, Matt was making an appearance. He was a master at it. We won't do it again. Stephen breathed a sigh of relief. He, too, would like silence now. That's what he'd come here for. Silence. The priest's voice, his wisdom and prohibition. Stephen was determined to confess that sin today and timidly hoped that maybe he wasn't a particularly religious man, but maybe he wouldn't be denied. Maybe all was not yet lost. Finally, the sermon began. The Holy Father started talking about how harmful it was to spend money carelessly and how it could ruin a person in general. Stephen sighed again with relief. He had feared it would be about something family-related, like how it was wrong to abandon his elderly, sick parents. Stephen had lost track of time. He felt like he'd been here forever. He even started to get annoyed that it was taking so long. He immediately gave himself an imaginary slap for such inappropriate thoughts. But at last the sermon was over, and Stephen began to make his way through the congregation. Everyone was saying a different word to the Holy Father. Do I need to confess? Hotly blurted out Stephen. The imp. Hello. Yes, of course. Stuart raised an eyebrow in surprise, but on the whole was not fazed by the assertion. If you be so kind as to wait for one more person. Okay. Stephen wiped his palms on his pants and sat down in the pew to wait. The church was almost empty. Stephen glanced nervously at the confessionals, wondering if it would be soon. And when the door opened, he jumped up and was about to enter. But a few moments were enough to recognize the man who had come out of the confessional, and for many years Stephen had not thought of him. His brain had discarded his image as unnecessary garbage for lack of use. Now, however, cold as a stormy sea, green eyes, short blonde hair so white it looked gray. But the man was not an old man. He was no more than 30 now. And then, on the night of the crippled man's arrest, barely 20 came out, cast around. A distracted glance passed Stephen, almost hitting him with his shoulder. Not in his eyes, not in his facial expression, not a shadow of recognition. Stephen, on the other hand, recognized it and knew for sure. There was no mistaking it was him. But how? Why? Now that night was printed in memory as an image on the first photographs of the 19th century with time faded, but you can see the important details. And yet it all seems so unreal. Sir, the priest's concerned voice brought him out of his stupor. Stephen shook you badly. You turned pale, added Stuart sympathetically. "Ah, no, thank you, I'm fine," Stephen muttered. "You seem to want to confess," with a soft, friendly smile. The priest made an inviting gesture with his hand. I, Stephen, did not stop feeling like a great sinner in the blink of an eye. But just now any mood for what I had planned was fading away. "Excuse me, I'll come back later," he muttered, and hurried away from the church to Sun Street, to the air. He urgently needed to get out of the room and into the open. Stephen wandered down the quiet street, where every house was decorated from the front with boxes of flowers and climbing plants, and under the blind of the still sun he sank further and further into the events of that night. He just had to hand over the package. James had given the address and the exact location. He added that the man would come to pick up the package and pay what was due. In the meantime, he gave him an advance. And everything seemed simple. The only unusual thing was that for this Stephen had to turn to an expensive neighborhood of Dublin, where he had never been before. It all seemed an adventure to the young cripple. Jamie said that he was well paid for delivering the shipment, but since he was out of business himself, the money was due to the new courier. That afternoon, Stephen had just had another argument with his mother. She'd blown off what was due on the utility bill, and to relax a little and cheer up, because the matter was murky, he'd stopped at a bar on the way. Stephen saw no contradiction in that. He hated his mother, but he thought he was in control. The only way he could get rid of the alcohol, by the way, was to go to jail, where it wasn't, of course. And in the bar, Stephen ordered the most expensive and strongest drink. He told the bartender, "How old are you, son?" He frowned. "I'm not your son," Stephen muttered and slid a €50 bill. That's the way to go, including bribes. The barman took the money and poured. Then another and another. And when he got to the specified address, Stephen barely kept on his feet. He was confused and almost turned inside out when he realized that in front of him was a cemetery, or rather, the part of it that was melancholically desolate. The sun, meanwhile, had been completely replaced by the moon. The full, milky pale high fence was killed by ivy. And Stephen frowned. There must be a proper entrance here. What would he say, the caretaker? Nothing. It's not a museum. And they don't charge admission. I don't care. Stephen grinned to himself. Maybe he has a grandmother baroness buried here. But it was too lazy to look for the gate. But there was a hole in the fence. In one place, the bars must have fallen out from rust. Stephen was a teenager then, so it was easy to fit through the hole. He looked at his watch. It was still an hour before the appointed time. Well, that's just it, he decided. I'll wait. A cool breeze and a special atmosphere. All these crypts, the statues of angels who seemed to be watching him, all this would sober Stephen up. He was tense and confused, because it suddenly became so nauseating to wait there, in the agreed place, under a huge oak tree, and because there too stood the statue of an angel. He was dropping tears and reaching out his stone hands to someone. Stephen would not let go. The stupid thought that if he turned away for a moment, the statue might come to life, throw itself at him, because he wasn't a very nice person, was he? Vaughn noted another drinking buddy of his mother the other day and whistled after the girls in short skirts, and he disturbed the eternal peace of ladies and gentlemen. So Stephen wandered away, decided that he would walk a little way and come back. He had sobered up, and now he was gnawing with curiosity. What was he handing over for a few €1,000? Certainly not a love note. His fingers took the roll out of his pocket and unwrapped it. Under the dirty cloth was a scrap of newspaper, in which was wrapped a wooden polyhedron covered with strange golden squiggles. It looked like a puzzle. The miniature box with the secret. Stephen began to twirl something in his fingers. What was it? His fiddling with the strange object was interrupted by a strange sound. In fact, it had been heard for about 5 minutes. But at first Stephen had thought it was a night bird. But now it must be because he had gone further into the cemetery. He realized it wasn't a bird or the wind. It was a voice. It sounded like a man reciting poetry. Only it sounded animalistic. It was like a chaotic jumble of separate words, and yet Stephen could swear to it. There was a certain order to it. It was like a song or a spell of dark magic. I'm surprised at the nonsense that comes to mind. The courier began to hastily pack the wooden something back, but somehow he accidentally pressed on the wooden edges, and they opened with a quiet click, revealing a black gut, and in it shone a diamond. Stephen had never seen a real diamond in his life, but he guessed it at once. And although he had never suspected in himself such a craving for beauty, he found himself infected by the pure radiance, like the light of stars in the game of multicolored sparks. The stone was large, even by the standards of gems, huge, and it was scary to imagine how much it was worth. Stephen realized he was holding his breath only when his chest ached and his eyes darkened. The smell of bodies, bread and nervous air. And he started to close the secret box. There was no need to guess. Decent people don't pass gems with boys from the poorer parts of Dublin. So the stones are stolen. Stephen, of course, had been in many stories in his life, but he had never been involved in outright criminality. The strange noises subsided, and at the same time he realized he was no longer alone in the cemetery. He was just lucky he was standing behind another statue, not of an angel, but of a huge dog. Apparently, some rich aristocrat had decided to bury his favorite dog here with honors. Kostya sat down, because a figure separated from the nearest crypt under the creak of closing doors and floated along the path. He could not see the face or the body. Everything was hidden. A floor-length and dark cloak in a hand, draped in a dark glove, swayed an antique-looking oil lamp. Stephen crouched down, clutching at the cold stone in his gut that on no account should he be seen. And when he peered out cautiously, the figure was already melting into the distance. Stephen wiped his forehead, cold sweat coming out. He felt like a character in a Hollywood thriller. "What kind of day is yours?" the guy noted. "Ours." There were almost 40 minutes left till the meeting with the mysterious recipient of the cargo. "We have to wait." But Olga was now gnawing with curiosity. And what was that strange person doing in the crypt? There was definitely a mystery here, and Stephen wanted to solve it. That's why he went to the crypt. "I'll just take one look," the boy promised himself. The heavy door was ajar. Turning on the flashlight on his phone, Stephen dedicated the top. O'Neill read the letters embossed above the crypt entrance, and he realized it was the last name of the family members lying here. Thoughts popped into his head about how there must be a lot of germs in here. Stephen's first teacher, Miss Charlotte Lewis, hated two things: dirty and lack of discipline. The latter was dealt with by the use of a pointer, under which the offenders had to put their palms under. Stephen learned about the fact that children should not be beaten, by the way, only at the age of 13, when the school scandal broke out because of Mrs. Lewis. And for the first, this teacher had hundreds of stories in the style of that one boy ate unwashed apricots and died, and another stroked a stray dog and went blind. "It's a good thing you're not around." Ms. Lewis grinned. To encourage herself, Stephen and stepped into the crypt. Silence. Emptiness. Except for the burials. Well, what else did you expect, you idiot? He was about to leave when he realized there was another door in the back of the building. There must be mice or rats in there. Please let it be rats. Stephen pleaded to himself, because something was making noises. A couple of steps, peering in, devoted to the phones. Sarcophagus on a pedestal, white marble. The lid was made by a skilled craftsman. It depicts a sleeping warrior with sword in hand. "Is anyone alive?" Stephen asked. I wondered why his voice had dropped. "Fear, I suppose." "Oh, that's creepy." But he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. No one answered. So the strange sound must have been imagined. Boom. Luckily, it didn't hit inside the crypt, but outside. A sudden thunderstorm had begun. Stephen jumped up, dropped the phone, which bounced off the corner of the sarcophagus and fell behind it. It was brand new. I'd been saving up for it for 6 months. Where could I get a new one? However, if someone reminded himself Stephen did not behave like an idiot and quietly waited for the client, It was possible to buy a new smartphone with payment. Now it would be impossible to miss the customer at all. What time is it? Does not enter the crypt of poisonous vipers. Thoughts were racing, and not at once Stephen made out what was going on above him. Now there were sounds coming from the crypt itself and from the sarcophagus. It seemed as if someone was lurking there. The scraping was accompanied by a groaning that made the blood freeze in the veins. Earlier, when Stephen sometimes watched horror movies, he used to marvel at how stupidly their characters behaved. But he himself was no better. Instead of picking up the phone and running away, he spread out and stared at the sarcophagus. It appeared as if its lid had shifted. No, it had been lying ever so slightly crooked all along. On an impulse, Stephen began to move it to the side. Then he shone the light directly into the sarcophagus, and what he saw he could not forget. Actually, it was because of what he saw that Stephen went on a panic run, in which he dropped the diamond, dropped the box, and then, in shock, flew out into the streets of the suburbs and ran into a police patrol. He burst into tears like a little boy. And when the officer recognized him as a thief, he did not resist and only nodded in response to the words that "You will go, boy, with us to the station, and there is safe." And from nerves, Stephen asked. The two patrolmen looked at each other. Yes, where else but there? The younger one answered, "You all right? Are you feeling okay?" "No," answered Stephen. "I don't know. Please save me." The teenager turned up his nose. The flashlight beam, faint but piercing, bright for this time of day, revealed a scene in which nightmare was strangely combined with Gothic aesthetics. True, Stephen hadn't thought about it at the time. His brain just absorbed what he saw and signaled it. "We're in trouble. Let's run and see if it catches up with us." There was something lying among the sweet-scented snow-white lilies. Stephen at first thought it was a sculpture. He saw the tall features of a face made of marble, and part of the face was hidden. On the head of the one lying there was a helmet gilded, or perhaps gold. His attention, however, focused on something else. A few seconds passed, and it came to Stephen's attention. No, it was not a statue, but a man. Another wave of cold fake sweat. It trickled from between his shoulder blades. Had the bartender stirred in the last cocktail? Stephen pressed his palm to his stomach. The syrup was sweet. Cream, tomato juice. But the whiskey made a nasty mess too. Alcohol's evil. Consciousness prompted again. Maybe he'd passed out and was sleeping under a bush. Or maybe it is white fever begins. What are its symptoms? And then Stephen decided to check it out. That's a real person lying there. It's just the way he looked. I mean, it was like he was too perfect. Poor thing, Stephen thought. Must have died young. It's not the money that makes you happy, so it's better to be poor but alive. He reached for the body where the hands with gold rings were folded on the chest. The fingers clutched the hilt of an ancient sword. A strange sight for sure. It seems that in the olden days, warriors were placed in mounds with all sorts of bling. But it's fresh. Stephen took a noisy gulp of air, and his stomach seemed to settle down. The palm of the boy's hand went down to the chest of the one who lay in the sarcophagus. It was cold. Or was it the clothes? A strange leather jacket like the ones they wore in the olden days was freezing. It's a cold night. Wait, why is a modern man dressed like that? That's for sure. The rich have their quirks. Stephen, it's silly to giggle, because his buddies will be shocked when he tells them. It's not like drawing pictures on the wall of City Hall. Who's gonna believe him, though? I'll take one ring. What does he care? Stephen muttered and grabbed the man's hand. And the next moment, Stephen suddenly met his gaze with green eyes. His heart sank, his body stiffened as much as the one lying there. And then the one lying down smiled, contrite, and sat up abruptly. Stephen's wrist was in the grip of icy fingers. Green eyes turned, and from the mouth came the hiss, or rather the warning roar of a beast ready to attack. In the next instant, Stephen wailed from staggered. He lashed out and turned and flung himself away. Rather, the bushes whipped, spit in the face. He twisted his leg. I don't care. Just to get away. It's spurring me on. Intoxication. Stephen just flew forward. He didn't stop, even though his lungs were burning with fire. Doing what? What's following his trail? He's from a sarcophagus that flies. Maybe he's already grown wings and will crash down from above. Stephen sobs, so he sped up. And then there was the street, the police patrol, and the arrest. Apparently, he looked really bad because at the station, before locking him behind bars, in his cell, the policeman who had inquired about his well-being gave him coffee and fed him donuts. Stephen swallowed it all and went into withdrawal. He confessed to stealing the tape recorder, and then didn't really give much credit for other things. Hooliganism, insulting authority figures, shoplifting, usually chocolate bars and potato chips. But he flatly refused to talk about why he'd been scared and what he'd asked to be rescued from. But because he didn't want to be sent to a mental institution. And then he'd probably have to tell about the diamond too. And that Stephen was a freak. It's a real mess. How many years has it been since then? And then in broad daylight, miles away from Dublin, and in a church in a place like this, he met this man. Same eyes, same nose shape. 10 years on, but Stephen would have sworn it was him. It only created more confusion in his mind, though. No, as time went on, the guy stopped thinking he'd stumbled upon a real vampire or some other ghost. That's bullshit. There's no such thing. There's got to be a rational explanation for everything. And then, over the years, this episode went, as they say, to the farthest shelf in the vault of memory. But still, now the memory is refreshed, as if it happened yesterday. And I should be glad. It turns out there was definitely a man in the crypt, but something was bothering me. It was as if seeing him was an omen. Stephen didn't realize how he'd gotten home. It's called a footstep. Before everything went wrong, he'd thought he'd be able to relax a little on his legal day off. After he gets some help at church, that's how it works, right? After that, he wouldn't go to the pub for a drink. He's been out of that for a while. Ever since that day. But the pub was the best place to get the best. Chicken fried wings, perhaps. Stephen was going to have a bite of that. But now, of course, he didn't go. He lay on the bed, not developing. Stupidly did not care about the cleanliness of the house, was just lazy. But by evening and the stomach demanding sounded. And had to go to the kitchen, where he ate what piled up in the freezer instant macaroni and cheese for the microwave. And then already separated in wall in his outer clothes with pants to sleep. And what luck that there were no dreams tonight. What are you like? Matt asked the next day. You'd think you were dancing with the elves all night, not sleeping, wouldn't you? The friend grinned. Matt, like many locals, was quite serious about the little people, with whom, according to Irish mythology, both elves and creatures, medium between trolls and dwarves, were related. Or maybe Matt was playing with his eyebrows. You didn't get enough sleep, pretty girl. Stephen let the horseshoe pass not only in his ears, but also in the ears of the other bachelors at the firm. There was a perception that Matt had been pregnant again since finding personal marital bliss with the graying of his Mary's benches. We've been doing it ever since and trying to set others on the same path. It's just been that kind of day. Listen, let's get down to business, or we won't be able to do it until New Year's Eve, Stephen replied. But it must have sounded a little rude, because Matt chirped and, grabbing the creamery materials, moved to the other end of the room. The sun was hiding behind the clouds on the seaside today, and the wind was coming in gusts. All in all, the weather was just right for hard work. Excuse me, a ringing maiden's voice brought Stephen out of his musings. In spite of the further heavy thinking, he was distracted by the yesterday's meeting, and even smiled involuntarily. I ordered a pizza for lunch, Tessa said, fixing her red curls that had been knocked out of her neck by the wind. And they told me they were having a promotion in 2 at the same time. So maybe you boys would like some pizza too. Pizza's a good thing. Murdoch's all fired up. Oldest guy on the team. A jack of all trades, he said he'd work for another year and retire to live on the beach with his wife, devoting himself to fishing. T. O'Neill, 26, single, not in a committed relationship, orphan, but has an older brother with whom they live together. She is an interior designer by profession and calls this house her best and most important project. Loves Italian cuisine, loves to dance. Dreams of having a street Bernard. Can't stand dirty jokes. All this information Stephen didn't collect, but it was dumped on him by Matt. And Stephen had a suspicion that someone was trying to take on the role of matchmaker. Except it was no use. No, in theory, he recognized that Tessa O'Neill was a very attractive girl. They say she has natural beauty and a striking liveliness of disposition. She had waist-length red hair and freckles to match. Now in spring on the face brightness, as if opened on the forest edge, the first flowers. Tall height and slender figure with feminine forms. TLC is most often seen in dresses, flying skirts. She is so romantic. It was also known that Tessa's parents left her and her brother a decent inheritance, but she is not Matt at resorts and parties, and learned and works hard. Also supports the local animal shelter for homeless animals. Good girl. Never thought about hopping in a cab though. What the hell? They belong to different worlds, don't they? He's a loser, a 30-year-old man without a corner of his own, and with such moral baggage that if he'd lived like this 300 years ago, he would have been banished from the city gates. In general, Stephen kept his distance. Even in his mind, almost always succeeded. However, that didn't stop him from admiring, of course. Ms. O'Neill in theory. The break with pizza had a beneficial effect, and after it the work boiled over with redoubled vigor. God willing, we'll be done by next weekend, Murdoch said, arching his back. Stephen nodded. The work was really coming to an end. It was time to wallpaper and install the outlets, and then they could turn in the project and get an estimate. And Mrs. O'Neill would no longer loom before his eyes. An unhappy thought came to his brain. Stephen mentally slapped himself on the back. You're thinking about the wrong thing. It's time to settle down. Somewhere he was tired of wandering around Ireland and living in the present day. Wanted stability, wanted to put down roots. Maybe it would keep him from the pain of the past. At last it was quite evening. The workers were leaving, but Stephen was still lingering. He stood on the veranda and the second floor of the house, from which he had an impressive view of the coast. Light-colored sand, tall grasses. The wind almost always blew here, and it must be fresh here, even on the hottest day. Stephen ran his palm over the smooth, dark wood. The top of the veranda fence was made of it, and the wall of the house on this side, where the spacious living room was. There were 3 of them in the house, and they were all glass. Suddenly, an image flashed in my mind of a weekend table for the whole family in this living room. A young woman like Tessa. Of course, one day she'll have beautiful children. And her husband. He's got to be a real man. He's got to be a real man. He's got to carry her around and never hurt her. He certainly shouldn't be like me. Stephen grinned bitterly, thinking that he himself had as much chance of having a normal family as of going to the moon. Because somehow, since his youth, life had gone wrong. And what good can come from that? Today's a good day, isn't it? TPP appeared on the veranda so suddenly that Stephen flinched. She stopped a step away from him, resting her hands on the railing. The wind flew in powerful gusts and ruffled her long new skirt. A snow-white tank top was tucked beneath a cashmere cardigan, and Stephen hastily averted his gaze from the seductive forms. Got himself a freak, thought he, angrily. A girl like that would never look at someone like you. Tessa started a conversation about what remained to be done in the house, and Stephen agreed that yes, it was probably not too late to make changes to the skirting boards. But of course, that would have to be reflected in the estimate and so on. But I think I'll go, he said, glancing at his watch, as if he had somewhere to go. But he just realized he had to go. Oh, I've totally lost you guys. Tessa laughed and deftly twisted her hair into a tangle. She intercepted the silk elastic band with pearls that had been dangling from her wrist as a bracelet. The wind picked up even more. And now even the seagulls flying over the coast were noticeably flapping in its gusts. "No, it's all right," Stephen smiled embarrassedly. "It's just that you probably have a lot of plans for the evening. We're all about business." "Well, I'm not really doing anything tonight," Tessa shrugged. "My brother will be busy with our shields, and I'll probably just watch a comedy movie," suggested Stephen. "No," shook her head at Tessa, and the pearl earrings on the long chain swayed in time with her movement. "Melodrama. I want something about love." "I see," Stephen mumbled, and for some reason got busy with the coloring. Then he decided it was time to leave. He went down to the first floor, and already at the front door, he realized that something was missing. Of course. And the toolbox is an idiot. A brand new set that had cost him almost 400 euros. Could have cost less, but it was a good set, and with a lot of useful things for a builder of repairmen who wants to work in tone with modern technology. Could have picked it up tomorrow, of course. It wouldn't have gone anywhere overnight from the house. But Stephen had a thing for keeping all his stuff with him and in neat order. So he made his way to the room where they worked. Tessa seemed to be planning to set up a guest room here tonight. Stephen, if it were his house, would have used it for a home library or nursery, because the windows looked out onto the garden. On the first floor of the house, the lights were off everywhere except the hallway. But basically the night was cloudless, and the moon was full, so there was visibility. As Stephen entered the room, he bumped into someone. And it wasn't Tessa, and the moon was just across the window, so he could see who was in front of him, and it was the one with the wine eyes, and the type. Stephen froze. The guy froze, too, and the eyes in his face became like black holes. It seemed that he was about to grin his face and let out a trumpeting animal roar. But instead, the one who stood opposite only exhaled in astonishment. "You are not Yura," answered the seated voice Stephen, and paid the price. On the plus side, the fact that he had met his past at all was a plus. Now it was clear that in front of him was a living person, which meant that he then did not catch a hallucination of a rebellious ancient knight. But the minus also outweighed it. This person also remembered everything, and was just furious and stepped on with a very bad look. "I wonder," thought the heavies. "Stephen, why is he angry? That you disturbed his peace. What the hell was going on in there? Where's the stone?" A stranger from the past grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, pulling him closer. "Where's my diamond? And the precious gem?" Stephen, of course, remembered after the arrest, and more than once, but thought that since it was not possible to pass on, it would be better for him to keep quiet, so as not to get even more trouble. "So it's yours. What is it?" "I don't know. I lost it." The green eyes didn't believe him. "Where's the diamond? Tell me." "Or what?" Stephen felt an inappropriate sense of humor. "I don't see a sword on you." The next moment he saw it thrown before his eyes by some dexterous trick at the door leading to the lower terrace. The blow knocked out his breath. In this part of the house it was necessary to remove the finished floor at the last moment in order to get to the wrongly laid communications. What was the other firm doing anyway? And Stephen was unlucky. Collapsed right into the hole. But lucky too, because his back hit the smooth, not the pipes. He didn't move much. No, I don't think his spine's broken. You know, it's just luck. Green eyes, and who's clearly used to solving problems with his fists, also ended up in a hole. And he's hovering over Stephen again. We were wondering what idiot the courier handed the shipment to. Couldn't find it. And then the dumbass died. Jamie's mind was moving the gloomy little man. "I guess did you kill him?" Green Eye's eyebrows crept upward in surprise. "Why?" "No, he was an asshole, crossing the road where he shouldn't. He didn't have time to tell me exactly who he gave the stone to. But now I remember the face. There was no one else at the cemetery that night. So where is it?" "I don't know. Stephen's in my clutches and grip. I never thought of myself as a weakling, but there was nothing I could do against this type, and he suppressed not only physically, but as if he radiated energy of danger, cruelty. That's how the rival stretched out and suddenly smiled, as if he remembered something. He looked around at the whole construction pit. And you know, in the olden days, that the house stood centuries, and for good luck the foundation was taken. Zamulia sacrifice. When the rooster animal what? But human sacrifice is best. So maybe since you're so useless, you've forgotten everything. So unlucky. It's worth leaving you here, you psycho, whispered Stephen. And then suddenly he learned evil and charged upward with his knee. Gotcha. Green eyes lined up, and with a lingering sideways glance the enemy collapsed. Stephen, with the trot of a frog, climbed out of the hole. Purely masculine. He understood that mean blow. Really painful beyond belief. What's going on here? There was a worried voice. Tessa had turned on the light in the room and now looked out onto the veranda, frowned when he saw the head of the man in the hole behind Stephen. Kirk, what are you doing there? We need to call the police. Stephen blurted out. That psycho snuck into the house and... That's my brother, exclaimed Tessa, and rushed to the hole from which Zeal, obviously still in pain, was climbing out. What the hell is going on here? Stephen stood in shock. This psychopath is Tessa's brother. In general, the girl told herself a lot about him, Tala, about how kind, wonderful he was, how after the death of her parents he took care of her, and for her sake he gave up his career as a detective, took over the family business. Both that man and this one couldn't be the same person. I'm fine, Kirk muttered. And the windpipe is all over the construction dust. Tessa, who is this guy, and how did he end up in our house? Him. The girl looked at them in turn. Stephen the builder, he works here. For a few minutes there was silence around the little company. The only sounds were the sound of the surf in the distance and the singing of a bird in the garden. Yes, Patrice nods flowers. The girl exhaled. The test had taken place. Stale and masking whiskey. How about we drink tea and talk quietly about everything? Judging by Kirk's face, to speak now he would prefer the last word over his opponent. But Stephen decided that to spite this man, who by his face and first impression would play villains in Hollywood action movies, he would keep peace for Tessa's sake. They went into the kitchen, and this room was the first to be finished and arranged as it should be. That was what the thoughtful Tessa had decided, and so now it was quite cozy. The girl piled tea, took out sandwiches and cakes from the refrigerator, put cookies on the table, and offered to have a snack. But her offer was ignored. Boys are boys, she grinned. Take a seat between her brother and Stephen, who looked at each other without even thinking, drawn to the drinks and food. So, what are you two fighting about? He stole our diamond, Kirk said flatly. No, he didn't. I dropped it or something, shrugged Stephen. Who stole it? What are you talking about? Asked Kirk. Is it fair to pass on jewelry like that with a guy from the suburbs? Like it's something criminal? Stephen made a logical argument. Or am I missing something? You don't have to understand. We should have just handed over our damn diamond. Kirk stepped forward. It seemed that in a moment he would jump up on the table and throw himself at his opponent. Maybe then we should have gone out after him, as we had agreed with the courier. Stephen raised an eyebrow expressively. Not lying in the crypt. What was that all about? What if I had a weak heart? What's this masquerade anyway? Where's the diamond? You expect me to believe anything you say. You know, when I first asked about it, I could tell you knew what I was talking about. So you stuck your nose in what you were asked to tell me. You think it's okay to be curious. And you expect me to believe that when you saw the jewelry, you didn't run away with it. I did. Kirk grinned. How convenient. And there's no proof. You, by the way, tried to take the ring off me in the crypt. I'd been drinking, and I felt awfully awkward. I was drunk. That's great. I think I'm starting to believe that a drunken idiot could actually lose what was entrusted to him. But how do you explain what? All right, stop. You're standing up, spreading your arms like a referee in a boxing ring. It seems we need to clear something up, and for that everyone needs to calm down. I am calm, Kirk muttered, but sat back down and even drank his tea defiantly. Petrus spoke up, addressing Stephen. After their parents died in a car accident, it was just the two of them. She was 15, he was 18. Her father owned a large firm involved in the production and sale of automobile fuel. Kirk had hastily taken over the board of directors, although it had previously been assumed that Tracy would be the one to move into the family business because her brother had chosen a different vocation. But Tessa was still too young, and Kirk decided to postpone the dream. Relatives, of course, existed, but theoretically, because the father of the brother and sister had long ago cut all ties with most of them. The head of the family, Mr. John O'Neill, was also a passionate collector of precious and semi-precious stones. His last acquisition was a diamond from India, a unique stone of pink hue, which had a rich history and was shrouded in legends. It was not easy to get it. There was a fierce battle at the auction, and not only in the bids. There were attempts to bribe its organizers as well. John O'Neill won, but on the way, when the stone was in Istanbul, it was stolen, and it turned out that it was done by an old friend of the men's private club, Mr. Albert Free. Of course, O'Neill's lawyers were ready to take up the case, but John feared that Albert had decided to cover his tracks and hide the diamond somewhere irretrievably. Then he came upon members of a gang in Dublin, among whom were first-class thieves. They took the order and executed it brilliantly. But John did not have time to return his treasure. He and Number Kirk, who knew the whole story, had to eventually take care of the precious piece of his father's collection. The stone was to be delivered by one of the gang members, and it was Jamie. Yeah, well, the guy decided to take the case. I see, said Stephen. Well, he thought it was a criminal case. Turns out it was. Well, it wasn't exactly legal either, but he could understand Kirk. Now there was one more detail. What the hell was Kirk doing in the crypt? I could say it's none of your business, Tissa's brother replied. It's our family's. Kirk, please. Tissa soothingly covered his hand with her fingers. I realize almost no one knew about this, but I think he can be trusted. Kirk reddened his face, threw from Papeliev an extremely suspicious glance at Stephen, but nodded silently and spoke. John O'Neill was not the kind of man who made himself. The family's wealth had been handed down from generation to generation, and almost all the ancestors in the family believed it was for a reason. According to legend, success and prosperity were granted to the first member of the family, Sturhepnu, about 500 years ago, when a brave warrior was lucky enough to capture and take Princess Mary as his wife. And since then, for each man of the O'Neill family, when the time came for him to inherit after the death of the head of the family, it was his turn to undergo a kind of initiation and test at the same time. The essence of it was that a man had to put on a gilded helmet and take a sword, and also put on rings. Both, as the legend said, belonged to the same tribe. The heir also had to put on a shroud and spend the night in the crypt. And not just any night. He had to spend it in an empty sarcophagus that was meant for him in the future. Yes, that was the tradition. When a boy was born, a sarcophagus was ordered for his future, the same size as a grown man. By the way, it was believed that it would deceive the evil forces, and in infancy, childhood, the heir would not die. Kirk grimly explained an important detail of the sinister ritual. But it is necessary not just to lie down, but to sleep. That's why they also drink a decoction of herbs. Is it a sedative and a sedative? He grinned. You know, it's a very stressful environment. Stephen listened to this almost with a high jaw. So much for aristocratic family traditions. Creepy, isn't it? I must have had too little to drink. Kirk shrugged. I had nightmares, and I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. But then when you touched me, I woke up. Scared you. Scared myself, he answered for the first time, without malice, with a chuckle. I didn't realize who you were at first. I thought maybe Tomb Raiders. Who was that figure? I saw a man in a cloak come out of the crypt, Stephen said. That's why I thought I'd come in. It was me. Tessa sighed. You were a bit of a shock, Stephen, for a 15-year-old girl to be involved in something like that. What was I supposed to do? I shrugged. We had to honor tradition, but you were alone. I'm sorry, but who would blame you if you didn't do it? No one. Tessa agreed, but we couldn't insult Father's memory. She looked fondly at Kirk. I couldn't leave my brother alone. I had to be there in case anything went wrong. Of course you did. Stephen was confused. So since he was supposed to be asleep, that's what Diamond was supposed to take him? Yes, she nodded. I was going to wait in the car, then pick up Diamond and wait for him to wake up again. But then I heard my brother's voice, and I didn't see you running away. Kirk woke up. He wasn't feeling well. We came home, called the family doctor. It seems we didn't prepare the potion correctly. Stephen thought that personally he would not have been forced by any family honor. The memory of his ancestors to sleep in a tomb and drink a potion of unknown herbs according to the recipes of ancient witches. More tea, perhaps? Tessa suggested, and without waiting for an answer, jumped up from the table behind. I was in the kitchen. So you're saying you lost the diamond? Kirk's voice combined skepticism. I would if I believed in oaths, Stephen replied. I really needed the money then, and I really thought I'd make money on the delivery. I sympathize. Kirk grinned. You were left without a diamond and without money. I know it was a lot for someone like you. Janie must have passed the task on to someone just like you. Kirk indignantly clattered the dishes with the kettle. Kirk, Brian Neil Ono, behave himself. Kirk obeyed his sister enough to even throw a Stephen. I'm sorry, but you're partly right. The man grinned mirthfully. I needed that money badly. I thought I could get my mother into a rehab center, he added. Stephen had told almost no one about his past in recent years. It was just generalities, because what was there to tell? It's embarrassing. And that's if we don't talk about his last act, about betraying his own mother and leaving her to her fate. Suddenly Stephen spoke. Words poured out of him in a free flow. But he didn't speak in order to get sympathy. He just needed to share it all. His childhood, his youth, how his mother had left him, and how it had ended. He also told that about 6 months after he left his mother, he began to doubt the rightness of his action and decided that no, you can't leave her like that, even though drinking was, in fact, her choice. Stephen decided to go back, but when he arrived, it turned out that his mother had been moved to the hospital because her health had gotten quite bad. Hospitalized right out of the barracks. One of the homeless people sympathized and called an ambulance. Stephen rushed there and was allowed to enter the room. Since Adriana had no insurance, the hospital naturally provided the bare minimum of services. Doctors said that they managed to save the body, but the mind. In general, drunkenness and life shocks. All this led to the fact that Adriana began to go crazy, and the doctors said that according to the rules should be discharged, and further is not their business. Unfortunately, where will the patient go? Stephen was lucky to get a job on a fishing boat. Prospects were excellent, but that's if he lived alone, forgetting his mother. Now things had changed dramatically. With great difficulty, he managed to find a boarding house for the elderly, where Adriana with her diagnosis was accepted. And it cost a lot. Plus, there was a down payment for several months in advance. Stephen asked the owner of a fishing boat for help, and he agreed to lend the necessary amount. In return, however, Stephen had to work almost without a salary for about a year. He agreed. He paid for his mother, and then, when he started traveling around the country, he continued to do so. It was hard, but he kept going. The only thing he didn't have the strength for was to visit her. He had never seen her once in all those years. He still couldn't forgive her for ruining his new life through hers. She had ruined it for him too. And he was also afraid of her just reproaches. Though the doctors at that boarding house had said that Adriana had little grasp of reality. But lately the thing was that recently he had been contacted by the boarding house and told that his mother's condition was rapidly deteriorating. The doctors said to prepare for the worst, and Stephen sort of looked at himself from the outside. What kind of man is he? Is it even after so many years, And now that his mother has become quite old and helpless, he cannot let go of offenses, even if just. He could not find the strength to come closer to her, to brighten her last time with his presence, as a good son should do. Conscience was cutting, gnawing. When else would it make itself known through the years? A dull ache in once broken bones. Except Stephen couldn't cross that threshold. He couldn't not only not forgive, but agree that his mother was important in his life, not existing on its margins as an unfortunate duty, which he had to fulfill only for moral reasons. And when Stephen's story was over, when he had poured out his soul in front of these two, in fact, strangers, who had only once appeared in his life as participants in the unfortunate episode, he suddenly felt better. It was as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Kirk sat with his arms folded across his chest, looking past Stephen to the sea outside the window. Tessa shouldered his thin fingers and looked directly at Stephen, as if she intended to peer into the deepest corners of his soul. "What happened to you can't be compared to anything," Tessa said quietly. "Every person's experience is unique. But she hesitated because she obviously hurried to unite her feelings with her brother, whose opinion about the story Stephen did not yet know. "I can understand," she continued. "How does it feel to lose everything? We lost the family business, the competitors. They came in and took everything away. We went out of business and pretty much lost everything. We had to sell the family home. We couldn't keep it anymore. It turned out my father had a business loan, and the insurance was written in such a way that the insurance company refused to pay anything. We sold almost everything," Kirk added. "There's a little left, but it's crumbs compared to what it used to be. All the proceeds went into building this house. First they made the foundation. Then Tessa went to school to make it just the way she wanted it. Tessa had always wanted to live by the sea. What so many generations of our family had treasured was taken from us. But perhaps," he grinned thoughtfully, "it's for the best in a way. At least now I have a chance to do what I wanted to do. Otherwise I'd have been sitting in the big boss's office all my life." I think Tissot kicked him under the desk with his foot, because Kirk jerked and walked in, quietly sending his sister an angry look. "Well, sometimes, of course, the saying goes that it wouldn't have been lucky if misfortune had helped," Stephen said. "Only the price for change is high, isn't it? And as for me, well, I don't think my life can basically go back to normal. It just doesn't seem to be by fate." Stephen's a little miffed by that comparison. Come to think of it, they had lost everything, but had enough money to still build such a house by the sea in a resort town on the background of the fact that he was actually on the street. It certainly hurt. Plus the thought slipped in that if he hadn't gone to the crypt then, you would have taken the stone. He would have gotten the money, returned quietly by a different route, and not been captured by the police. He wouldn't have gone to jail. He could have put his mother in rehab. And the curse. His whole life could have gone right. Maybe if things hadn't gone so wrong back then. But it wasn't really Kirk's fault. It was Stephen himself who screwed it up. "All right, I'll go now." Stephen rose from the table. "Thanks for the tea." He smiled at Taxi. The girl got up to the sink with the dishes. Kirk rose to follow, clearly intending to walk her to the front door. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Stephen said, already on the doorstep with repairs. "Anyway, do you mind if I keep doing things around here?" "Why not?" Kirk shrugged. "As long as you're doing your professional duties, you're welcome to come." The words were said politely and to the point, but as if with an undertone. Stephen inwardly tensed that Kirk noticed the glances he was throwing at his sister. So they were just glances. It's clear as day that Stacy can be absolutely nothing. The next day was quite ordinary. The house was bustling with work, though she didn't show up at all. She usually stopped by every other day to see how the construction and finishing projects were going. This day everything was falling apart, but Stephen held his ground and didn't even swear when one of the workers, a young boy who was still a green trainee, accidentally dropped it on his foot. Returning home in the evening, Stephen habitually pressed the button on the phone to listen to the answering machine message. Usually there was nothing there, but now he heard an unfamiliar voice. He never hung his jacket on the coat rack. Stephen listened to him. The guy who introduced himself as Geoffrey said that they needed to meet urgently and talk. The matter is urgent. It concerns the boarding house where Stephen's mother lies. I'll be expecting you at the Gull tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock. Believe me, it's urgent. Stephen could not even guess who it was or what it wanted. But it seems that the mysterious Geoffrey did not belong to the staff of the boarding house. Work on the house involving Stephen's team. The next day were scheduled from 9 o'clock, so it was literally possible to get an hour off. The Seagull establishment was opened back in the 30s of the last century and served as a true gem of a marina, from which almost all 4 seasons opened pleasure boats running along the coast. Stepping inside, Stephen noticed it at once. A young fellow sitting at the farthest table, near which stands a lemon tree in a tub. On his head cap pretends to read a newspaper. Good afternoon. Stephen sits down on the seat opposite Geoffrey. Yes, he asked, and after a nod continued. I recognized him right away. It's just that those who are wearing caps now are walking around, and you are like hiding from someone. So what is it? What did you want? The waitress came over, and they both ordered a cup of coffee, so as not to sit empty-handed. Geoffrey was visibly nervous, but at the same time he gave the impression of an educated and serious young man. It turned out that a year ago his family decided to put his grandfather in the boarding house. Unfortunately, the old man was diagnosed with dementia, and he also constantly dreamed that he was being hunted by some secret agents. At first it turned out that everything was normal, and when Harry visited, he smiled, saying that everything was great, and the boarding house seemed just a resort. But then something alerted Geoffrey to this. Something was that Harry suddenly changed his delusional fantasies. Now he was saying that he and the other boarding house residents were being abused, and only on visiting days they changed him into clean clothes and told him not to complain to his relatives. And it was very strange, because the psychiatrist who had previously seen Harry said that his disease of the mind is characterized by a fixation on what has absolutely nothing to do with the surrounding reality. Grandfather said there was proof of that. Geoffrey continued with a sigh. He said that if you went to the first floor, you could go down to the basement, where they had made a punishment cell for the naughty ones. I decided to check it out, and when I left, I pretended I'd forgotten something in Grandpa's room and walked on unnoticed. I found the stairs to the basement. The door was unlocked, and there was a light on downstairs. There was indeed a room and a door with a window. I looked in and saw 2 orderlies tying up an old lady. It wasn't the kind of room where, they can lock up a violent patient for a while. It was just a hole with a cement floor walls. It was cold, damp. This poor woman was sitting on the floor in her nightgown. Her hands were shackled, seen shackled in museums. Could it be the same thing? I managed to make a short video. I managed to get up and pretend it never happened. I went to my lawyer, and he believed me. I was lucky. He said another man had approached him with the same complaints. His relative had given up a lot. His health got worse in that boarding house, and the lawyer said it was serious. The owner of the boarding house is a powerful, respected member of the community. The police would need a good reason, apart from the complaints of the old people and the videotape, which they would check if it was taken from a horror movie or a fake. And so I decided to contact other people whose relatives are in that boarding house and see if they noticed anything strange in the behavior or condition of their relatives. Maybe if we teamed up, we could make it work. Stephen listened to Geoffrey without interrupting, and he believed him from the first word, because his gut told him the guy wasn't lying. But there was something else that was dark, something that was bothering me. This woman you saw, Stephen asked in a hushed voice. What did she look like? Seemed very petite, Geoffrey said. Gray hair, cut short. It was dark in there, but I'd better show you. He hurriedly pulled out a smartphone and handed it to Stephen. That's my mother, Stephen said, barely seeing the video. But it took his breath away. I haven't seen her in a very long time. I've only been told she's doing well. That's my mother. I'm going to get her." He raised his voice so high and jumped up so sharply, almost knocking over a table, that other visitors to the Gull encroached on them. "It's not that simple." Jeffrey shook his head. "Did you read the contract to discharge the patient? His condition is mental and physical. A special committee must first determine. This is to protect the boarding house from possible claims. Suddenly, one of the old people will become ill due to the negligence of relatives when they have already taken the guest, and so there will be evidence that the deterioration is not the boarding house's fault. So it'll take about a week. Are you already taking the grandfather?" Stephen asked. "Yes," Jeffrey nodded. "I've applied." "I don't care." Stephen exhaled. "I'm not going to wait for her to be bullied any longer. I'm going right now." Only it was much easier to say than to do. The bus to get to the village, near which the boarding house was located, left only late at night, and there was no money for a cab because Stephen had not been spending his budget very carefully lately. The advance wasn't due until the day after tomorrow. On top of that, the phone was ringing off the hook. The foreman demanded that Stephen report to the site immediately or he would be fired. I had to comply. And besides, Stephen decided he'd try to get some cab fare from Matt or Murdoch, for instance, but when he got to the house, neither was there. The first had taken time off work because a child had fallen down the slide and had been taken to hospital with a suspected fracture. And the second went to scandalize the supplier of coffee tiles for the fact that, despite 100 clarifications, sent the wrong shade. So we'll have to wait. "Everything okay?" asked Kirk, who was in the house that day to sign a couple of papers to accept the delivery of the next final stage of work. Yes," nodded Stephen. Yesterday's state of mind, when he was pouring his soul out, was far behind him. But it wasn't completely silent either. "You're not wearing a face," Kirk snorted. "Is it something with your mother?" "Yes," Stephen blurted out. "I have to leave immediately." And he outlined the current situation in a few sentences. "You're talking. The lawyer's name is Archibald Stone. I know the guy. He and I go sailing sometimes. We've known each other since high school," Kirk said. "He said he's working on a case right now involving some big shot. I sympathize with you, but how are you going to pull this off? Do you want to just barge in and take her? Why not?" Stephen's fists were itching, as they say, and his thoughts were racing frantically. I'm afraid those words were not easy to say, but they had to be said. "I'm afraid I won't make it, Mom, if anything happens to her. I'm sorry. I must be distracting myself from the really important things," Stephen said with a bitter chuckle, because Kirk was suddenly distracted by his cell phone, apparently texting someone. "So I guess this is what we'll do," he muttered. "We leave in half an hour." "What?" Stephen rounded up, eyes at a loss. "Are you going with me?" "I think Dennis alone. Can you manage?" He smiled at Sill's eyes. "And I brought someone with me. So I think there's going to be a problem." "Yeah, that's probably it," sighed Stephen. "Not us, them." Kirk patted him on the shoulder. And it came out so unexpectedly reassuring and friendly, almost brotherly, that Stephen's heart warmed. Stephen had thought the foreman would grumble, perhaps threaten to quit. But when Kirk had said a word or two, he let him go easily. "I told him that I was paying for the construction, so I had the right to take you away for a while if I really needed to, on personal business. And I said that if he didn't have time to do something because of that, I wouldn't make any claims, and I'd pay for an extra day for the crew to finish everything." Cleared Zelina's situation. The eye cut out onto the suburban highway. The car was driving at the maximum allowable speed, and taking into account that the highway was busy, Stephen was forced to admit. Great driver. Almost all the way past in silence, and when they arrived, at the gate of the boarding house territory, they were met by another car, from which came out some very formidable-looking shaven-headed type in a black leather jacket. "Who is it?" Stephen asked bluntly, because he didn't quite know what was going on. "An acquaintance," carelessly clarified Kirk, clearly not wanting to go into detail. "Let's say, although the firm is gone, but there are still some old connections. He was silent for a while, and while they were waiting for the guard to come out of the gate, he continued. In general, if we tried hard, we could keep the firm 10% to success. Theoretically there was, but Tessa wasn't ready to shoulder the load. And it's not that I chickened out, but my father always said if you're not sure about something, you shouldn't do it. We saved what we could. And I think we're on the right track now. The guard who came out said glumly that today was not a day for visiting guests, which means they need one. We need to see the director of the whole place, about his skinny-headed type. Look, you're not a security guard. I was about to object, but the skinheads did. Leaned over to him, whispered something in his ear, and the guard's face stretched. His face turned pale. Why didn't you say so in the first place? Almost. He shouted in a frightened voice and opened the gate, clearing the way. What did he say to him? Stephen inquired. He hinted that if we weren't allowed in, Mr. Jonathan Green would be very unhappy. That say, many people believe that he has something to do with our Irish mafia and that his name is on the rumor. And that it's true. Stephen was not at all smiling at having anything to do with the mafia. That's not exactly what people say, Kirk grinned. But Jonathan Gray was once my father's golf club partner. He nodded at the leather-jacketed man. His stepson Peter, who we shared a sandbox with. Nice to meet you. A pleasure. Peter asked menacingly without looking at Stephen. But if you have such acquaintances, why didn't you defend your father's inheritance? Stephen still could not see the logic in the actions of his brother and sister. I've already explained, Kirk answered sighingly but patiently. Father himself would have done the same thing if one day he could no longer manage the business properly. We would have brought the firm down and ruined all the reputation our family had built up. This way we kept the family honor and a few % of the stock. The cars stopped in the parking lot of the boarding house, and now there was no time to talk. Stephen could barely keep from breaking into a run. The guard, glancing at the small company, subserviently escorted them to the director's office, and now Stephen realistically barely restrained himself from just punching her with his fist, or preferably two. On the cold round face of the director with the connivance, or maybe with the instructions of which defenseless old people were treated so disgustingly. Unlike the guard, the headmaster was not so accommodating, and even the mention of the powerful Mr. Gray did not seem to affect him at first. However, he was still nervous, twirling the pen in his fingers. His eyes were racing. I swear, no one has ever complained about our establishment before. Finally, in desperation, he declared, we treat all old people as our own kin. And besides, pardon me, but the headmaster gave Kirk a hard look. Do we have any of your relatives, sir? No, fortunately not. Kirk grinned wickedly. I wouldn't trust you with an old rat, sir. And as for complaints, personally, since I have had no dealings with you, I will make no complaint. But when his palms hit the countertops, he jerked forward, nearly smashing his forehead into Nolito. The nervous beauty of the headmaster's face. But it would be sad if I witnessed my friend being denied his legal right to take his own mother. Wouldn't it? There's more to it than just the rules in your contract, right? And legally, you have no right to keep her. Isn't that right? I see you're well aware of that. The director's tone was more accommodating and almost visionary. Of course, I have now arranged for the mother of this esteemed Mr. Stephen to be helped to pack. Don't bother, snorted Kirk. You will escort him to her now. The headmaster reached again to loosen the knot of his tie with half a finger and nodded. One more thing, Stephen added boldly, and following Kirkorov's example, moved toward the director. Do you have another old man? Stephen's heart was allowed in this okay, which stopped. He walked down the corridor and pondered what to say to her. First of all, to apologize, to promise that he would not leave her again. But now they were in front of the ward. A nurse in a strict gray dress, who looked terribly displeased and but had to obey, opened the lock of the door, and it fell away. Adriana sat on the narrow bed and looked out the window. Or rather, at the window, because it was closed with the blinds down. How had she aged? Stephen thought. Is it really her, Mother? Quietly, he called out. Adriana slowly turned her head. At first, he thought it was too late, but the expression on her face had changed. And the main thing was not even the smile on her pale lips, but the way her eyes lit up in a flash. Stephen on the verge of hearing. She dropped the word son. I'm awake. No, Mom. Stephen, unashamed of the tears in his eyes, stepped toward her. A moment later, he knelt down in front of the bed. He plunged into the warm embrace of his mother's arms, just as he had done long ago, when he was a child. Mom, I'm back. I brought you back. Kirk and Peter froze on the doorstep, and then tactfully stepped out behind him and covered the door, so as not to interfere with the intimacy of two people finally dooming each other. However, it was still almost 2 o'clock before they could all leave the boarding house. The reason for the delay was Harry, who at first got scared, thinking that he had done something wrong and would be taken to the SAU for it. Then he said that secret agents from London were waiting to capture him and bring him to the tower to be tried by the Virgin Queen. The old man was so stubborn that Stephen finally decided on a highly atypical act. He said he had personally witnessed Harry's grandson deal coolly with a couple of such agents, and then took a written promise from them that they would leave Harry alone. And the scroll was secured with the Queen's ring. On a wave of creative imagination, finished Stephen. True raised bones and eyebrows that resembled Harry's snow-white caterpillars. And what was depicted on the seal? May I ask, Lilia? Assumed Stephen, belatedly remembering that it was a symbol of sorts from the French monarchy. Aha! Harry grinned and clapped his hands together. I knew Louis had something to do with this. Well, in that case, I'm calm. So what are we standing here for? Come on, let's go. And then, when they were already down on the porch, Harry turned toward the boarding house, picked up a pebble from the ground, and swung it at his neck. Sent it flying all the way to the window of the headmaster's office. Cool. Sincerely admired Stephen. Let's go quickly, he hurried everyone. But how did you do it? Geoffrey, whom Stephen had telephoned to say that Harry would be waiting for him at the Gull, was shocked when he heard what had happened. I'm not. Stephen shrugged his shoulders. Was that it? Him. He nodded at Kirk, who was clearly uncomfortable with being grabbed. And now he rolled his eyes and muttered that please stop talking about it, since the case was already done. I was at the lawyer's office, Geoffrey told me excitedly. He said the paperwork was finally ready. The last time I talked to him was a week ago, and he really seems to know how to work. So we're going home now. What about the family? Stephen asked. Won't they want to send Harry to the orphanage again? Or will you look for a good place this time? I actually thought it would be best for him, sighed Geoffrey. I think I'll take a vacation from work for a while. I'm a photographer for a magazine, and basically they can do without me for a bit. There's someone to replace me. I think I can look after Grandpa for a while, and then I'll think about it. But I certainly don't trust him to anyone else. The hero of the discussion was sitting there, and the varnish was chocolate for the money. The whole company occupied a large table, so there was enough room for everyone. Adriana just sat and looked through the window at the sea, over which seagulls were flying. It had been a long day. Stephen himself had to make up his mind. After all, he lived in a tiny apartment and could not imagine how he would be able to combine work and taking care of his mother, who still had a little bit, but had problems with consciousness. But once again, Kirk surprised him by saying that it was possible to hire a good nurse for Stephen's mother, or even better too, to work in shifts. And for comfortable living, of course, it would be better to move into a 2-room apartment. And then, of course, Adriana should be examined as soon as possible and as fully as possible to determine the necessary treatment for her. Unfortunately, Kirk noted, there was a strong possibility that she would still need constant medication and medical supervision. Thanks for the advice, Stephen sighed. But I don't think I can afford all that. I'll keep it simple, brief, and even a little strict, Kirk said. No objections, he added. An emotion of shock and amazement came over Stephen's face. I can help with that, Jeffrey said. You got my grandfather out of there. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Stephen was confused. What do you mean, essentially strangers? Yeah, they were both very wealthy, but it's still an offer of help. I don't know what to say. He expressed his feelings honestly. I just did. Thank you. I will. There's no need to say anything, Kirk said. Better just do it, and do it soon. He added, nodding at Harry, who was flirtatiously informing a passing young waitress that he could show her around the world because he had secret agents as friends. The next few days, or rather weeks, passed in incredible bustle. They seemed to stretch on like an eternity, and yet they flew by so quickly. Stephen's mother and he were settled in an apartment downtown, with attentive professional caregivers to help manage everything. Kirk helped Stephen negotiate an emergency vacation at work. Jeffrey kept him in the loop. The director of the boarding house and his assistants had finally been charged appropriately, and all the elderly wards had finally been taken care of. The renovation of the house, by the way, was finally completed, and one day Tessa said that she wanted to meet Stephen, that they needed to talk. At first it was about how nice the house was, and how glad Tessa was that Stephen was doing so well with his mother. And then somehow Stephen asked Tessa out on a date. She froze, frozen, with only her long pearl earrings swaying. And here I thought you'd never go for it. Suddenly she laughed. And I'll have to do it all myself. You mean ask you out on dates? That wouldn't be so romantic. He was amazed that she'd been looking at him for a long time. And now he could breathe a sigh of relief that the date had gone well. And then, yes, Stephen still mentally returned to his doubts that he was not a match for Odessa, and even thought with trepidation about how soon the relationship would undoubtedly have to be severed. We should talk, Kirk said. Stephen was at his and Tessa's house at the time. She had recommended him as a good repairman to several of her friends and had called him over to discuss details of future work and to give him a couple of tips on future clients. These friends, as Stephen realized, were very rich people, and he thus had the opportunity to build up a large client base so that he could leave the firm and work as a private master. Or maybe you could start your own company one day, Tessa told him. And it was clear she wasn't kidding. Good, agreed Stephen with a pick. The men stood on the veranda, the sun slanting over the horizon. Seagulls flew over the water. I didn't tell you this, Kirk said with a sigh. But my sister hopes you'll propose to her soon. Yeah, Stephen gasped with excitement. He had thought about it, but it seemed like an unrealistic dream. I've thought about it, he admitted. Good, Kirk nodded. Because I'm not going to let anyone play with my namesake. I don't know what she sees in you, but I respect her choice. Kirk's hand came down on Stephen's shoulder. The fingers squeezed made her happy. I believe in you. I'm giving you a chance. But remember, if you see my sister, I'll send you to the other world with my own hands. Stephen smiled. He had no doubt that he loved his namesake and that he would do anything to make her happy.